Hi, welcome back, everyone. This is your friend Greedy Fanfics, bringing you another fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the third part of What If Deku Had a Jackal Quirk. All credit for this story goes to ᴅᴜᴜ, so please support them by checking out the link in the description for more details. Don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more content like this. Now, let's get into the fanfic. Izuku had only broken 3 fingers so far. Progress. Really. He and Tashinori were in a forest-type area on UA's campus. They'd been working at One for All for a couple days now. Izuku didn't think he was getting much better at regulating the power, but Tashinori assured him it was just a matter of time. It didn't help that Izuku was distracted. Ida's brother had been attacked by the hero killer Stain. He was alive, but badly injured. Izuku couldn't imagine how Ida felt. Ida had assured Izuku that he would be fine. But he'd taken an internship in ᴅᴜ City. The city where his brother had been hurt. The city where the hero killer was still on the loose. So Izuku had a lot on his mind, which is perhaps why he hadn't yet tried to talk with the Jackal. Okay, he just didn't really want to and was putting it off. But there was also a lot going on. Alright Midoriya, that's enough. Tashinori called. He was frowning. You seem distracted. Sorry. Izuku rubbed at the back of his neck, or attempted to. He'd forgotten a couple of his fingers were broken, and touching them against his neck made him hiss in pain. Let's get you to recovery, girl, Tashinori said. One of his large hands pressed lightly between Izuku's shoulder blades, urging him forward and steering him towards the infirmary. Recovery girl was not pleased. You can't keep doing this to your body, she yelled, irritated enough that Izuku could see a vein throbbing in her forehead. I was able to use it a couple times though before I broke them. Izuku offered his progress in hopes it would make her less angry at him. She made a humping noise before she whirled on Tashinori. And you, she snapped. You're encouraging this. Do you even care that he could end up with worse scars or lose function in his hands and arms? The look that crossed Tashinori's face made Izuku's chest ache. He looked almost devastated at Recovery Girl's words. Izuku knew Tashinori cared. He cared a lot. It was probably partly why he'd started suggesting Izuku try to go back to tapping into the Jackal's power to help regulate the output of One for All. It's not his fault, Izuku cried. I'm the one who hasn't figured it out yet. No, Midoriya, this isn't on you. This is my failing as a teacher, Tashinori told him. Recovery made a disgusted sound. You two are too similar, she scoffed. Stop fighting over whose fault it is and just figure out how to fix it. With that she stomped off towards her office. Izuku and Tashinori both blinked and then looked away from one another. Then exhaustion hit Izuku like a truck. Lately it was starting to happen more and more often after Recovery Girl treated him. She told him it was normal since her quirk utilized Izuku's own body processes to speed up the healing process. Do you need help getting home? Tashinori asked. Glancing at the clock on the wall, Izuku saw it was almost 5. Izuku wanted to say no, he was okay. Tashinori didn't need to go out of his way just for him, but he was too slow in getting the words out. I'll walk you home, Tashinori told him, leaving no room for argument. Can you stand? Izuku nodded, but was a little wobbly on his feet. He was just so tired. Tashinori grabbed his arm to keep him upright and then took some of the gummies Recovery Girl had set nearby. Eat these. Tashinori handed them to Izuku, who slowly started eating them. The sugar and whatever else was in the gummies would help with the exhaustion. They always seemed to make Izuku feel less like falling on his face anyway. Is your mother home tonight? Izuku thought about it, then shook his head. She has an evening shift that starts, nowish, I guess. She'll be back in the early morning, I think. Tashinori frowned. I don't like the idea of you being alone like this, Tashinori murmured, brow creased as he thought. He was still holding Izuku's arm. Do you have a friend you could stay with? At least until your mother gets home? Izuku wasn't sure what it was that possessed him to say what he did. Really, he was just exhausted and didn't want Tashinori to leave. He and Toshinori were friends anyway, right? No, they were more than friends, bound by something stronger than blood. That's what Toshinori had told him once. We could go to your place. Toshinori stopped. He tilted his head and looked down at Izuku with wide eyes. Izuku really hadn't meant it to sound as suggestive as Izuku realized it probably sounded. He would have broken into a blush dark enough to obscure his freckles if he weren't so tired and also not quite sure why it was a bad thing to be suggestive right then. Izuku really just wanted to lie down. Preferably with Toshinori's shirt, or better, Toshinori himself. Is that? Toshinori coughed, cleared his throat. Is that okay? For a moment Izuku wasn't sure if Toshinori was asking the question to himself or to Izuku. Izuku answered anyway. Why, yeah. Izuku assured quickly and nodded his head to emphasize just how okay that was. He pulled his phone from his pocket and sent a quick text to his mother telling her he was staying with a friend for the night. When Izuku looked up from his phone he let out a laugh. Toshinori looked like a deer caught in the headlights. For some reason Izuku found that funny. Toshinori ducked his head and tugged gently on Izuku's arm. Come on then, Toshinori murmured. Izuku leaned heavily on Toshinori as they headed towards the station. He was honestly starting to feel a whole lot better. His mind was starting to feel less muddled too. Izuku could feel his face turning red as he realized how he'd sounded earlier, and why it was indeed a bad thing to sound suggestive. Still, he couldn't seem to pull away from Toshinori. He didn't want to, and Toshinori didn't seem uncomfortable or anything. The train was pretty packed when they got on. It was prime rush hour time, so it made sense. Toshinori managed to get them in a corner, his back to the wall and Izuku in front of him. He kept his hands on Izuku's shoulders, a comforting and steadying presence. Izuku was jostled from behind as the train started moving though and ended up in Toshinori's space, his head against Toshinori's chest. Izuku thought he heard Toshinori take a sharp intake of breath. Worried that he'd hurt him, bumped his scar or another injury or something, Izuku looked up at him with an apology on his lips. But Toshinori was looking away, up and to the side. His jaw was tight, and his face had more color than usual. Are you okay? Izuku asked. His throat felt dry and there was a pressure inside him he couldn't quite name. Fine. Toshinori bit out the word, his hands tightened just a little on Izuku's shoulders, not pushing him away exactly but still somehow holding him back. Izuku could feel the warmth of Toshinori's body against him, and he couldn't help it. He felt a whole lot better, but the warmth and feeling of comfort made him tired all over again. Izuku lay his head against Toshinori's chest and closed his eyes. He listened to Toshinori's heartbeat. It was steady but quick. A staccatoed sound that made Izuku sigh. They stayed like that until they got to their stop. When they got off the train, Toshinori tried to pull away just a little, seeing if Izuku could stand and walk on his own now. Izuku could, really. But Izuku took one of Toshinori's hands anyway. Toshinori made a sound low in his throat, something almost like a sound of distress or worry. But he didn't pull his hand away. Izuku hadn't been to Toshinori's apartment since the first time. It looked the same. A little small. Nice. Perfect. Toshinori paused in the entryway, seeming to try to decide what to do next. It was dinner time, so Izuku was pretty sure Toshinori was considering what to make. Izuku felt grimy from the day and wanted to shower too. It was then that he realized he didn't have a change of clothes. Maybe he could just borrow some of Toshinori's. Dinner? Toshinori asked, rubbing the back of his neck self-consciously. Sure, Izuku answered. As tired as he was now, at the prospect of food he noticed how hungry he was too. Now with some direction, Toshinori seemed to relax a little. He headed for the kitchen, and started looking through his fridge and freezer. Izuku padded after him, looking around the small kitchen. He spotted the rice maker. Where's your rice? Izuku asked. He started looking through a couple cabinets, something he never would have done if he'd been in his right mind. But he was hungry, and tired, and wanted to help. Oh, you should sit down, Toshinori said quickly. But it was too late. Izuku had found the rice. He shook the container a little triumphantly. Toshinori seemed torn between taking the container from Izuku and continuing to get the fish in the sink to thaw. Izuku was quick to get water and rice into the rice maker though. It chirped happily as it started cooking. Izuku gave Toshinori a cheery smile. Toshinori snorted a sigh and shook his head. But in a fond way rather than exasperated. "You're not helping with the vegetables," Toshinori told him pointedly. "I'm not letting you handle a knife. You look like you're about to fall over." Izuku made a face, but didn't protest. He did grab the vegetables and wash them though. Just so he was helping. The whole thing was, dare he think it? Domestic. That brought a wide grin to Izuku's face. "What?" Toshinori asked, noticing Izuku's expression. Izuku opened his mouth to tell him, but recognized even in his tired state that saying what he was thinking might not be the best idea. Do you like, cooking?" Izuku asked instead. Toshinori made a humming noise as he thought. "I didn't really have a whole lot of time for it most of my life," Toshinori admitted with a shrug. "Since I started teaching at UA, well, actually since I moved here really, I've been doing it more." Izuku watched as Toshinori chopped the vegetables and practiced motions. "I suppose there's some satisfaction in doing it, but—" Toshinori broke off, shook his head. His cuts became a little harsher. "It's not really fun just cooking for yourself," Izuku guessed. Toshinori froze for a moment, which was as good as a verbal confirmation. "I get that," Izuku assured him. "The days my mom works evening shifts are always really lonely. Those are the days I don't really look forward to going home." Toshinori was staring at him, but Izuku couldn't read his expression. It almost looked like Toshinori was fighting with himself about something. Izuku couldn't fathom what. How often does she work evenings?" Toshinori asked, and his voice sounded raspy, like his throat was dry. "Twice a week, usually," Izuku answered. Toshinori bit his lip. "What? You could always—" Toshinori broke off again. His knuckles were turning white on the hand that held the knife. Izuku felt a pull to reach out, to take Toshinori's hand, to touch him, but Izuku managed to hold himself back. "I could always— What, Toshinori?" Izuku asked softly. It was the first time since their not date that Izuku had used Toshinori's first name. Out loud anyway. The atmosphere between them had changed somehow. There was a tenseness, a pressure, something Izuku couldn't label and didn't fully understand, but it was there pressing down on both of them. Toshinori swallowed thickly. A shrill chirping sound came from the rice maker, breaking the spell. Toshinori startled, jerking. The knife sliced against the tip of his index finger of the hand holding the vegetable on the cutting board. Toshinori hissed. "Toshi!" Izuku felt suddenly wide awake as he grabbed a paper towel and then yanked Toshinori towards him. He wrapped it tightly around Toshinori's bleeding finger before taking Toshinori's good hand and forcing him to put pressure on it. "Where's your first aid kit?" he asked, hating that the question sounded stupid even to his own ears. It was just a small cut after all. "I'm fine, really," Toshinori tried to assure him. Izuku gave him an almost sharp look and, after making sure Toshinori was putting pressure on it, he headed towards Toshinori's bathroom. That was where he and his mother kept theirs, so it reasoned that Toshinori probably kept his there too. He heard Toshinori call after him, but Izuku didn't stop. He found the small kit in the bathroom and hurried back out to the kitchen. Toshinori had taken a seat at the table, a look of worry and concern clear on his face. He looked up when Izuku came in, his brow only creased more. "Here." Izuku set the kit on the table and gently took Toshinori's injured hand. Carefully, Izuku unwrapped the paper towel. He cleaned the cut, put on some antiseptic, and then a small bandage. Toshinori's hand was so much bigger than his own. His fingers were long and well calloused. Izuku kind of regretted not being able to hold his hand longer, but dinner still needed to be made. "Thank you," Toshinori murmured, sounding almost guilty. He tried to get up, probably to go back into the kitchen, but Izuku lightly pushed on his shoulders, keeping him seated. "I'll finish up," Izuku told him firmly. Tashinori blinked, his face colored a little. No, I won't use the knife. Izuku cut off his protests, rolling his eyes a little. You cut most of the vegetables anyway, it's just the fish. I can handle that. Izuku tried his best to sound stern, but he was pretty sure it didn't come across that way if Tashinori's small snort of laughter meant anything. Izuku went and finished up dinner. He knew how to cook pretty decently since he'd had some practice, and Tashinori told him where to find everything. Tashinori still had that almost guilty look on his face when Izuku finished and brought everything to the table. The adrenaline Izuku had felt at seeing Tashinori bleeding had faded, and he was starting to feel that bone-deep exhaustion again. Still, he ate and sat in comfortable silence with Tashinori, who, once they finished, told Izuku to go ahead and shower and he would do the dishes. Izuku was too tired to protest at that point. It was when he was outside the bathroom that he realized he didn't have anything to wear after the shower. Izuku glanced down the hall. Tashinori was still busy doing the dishes. So Izuku changed his trajectory and headed into Tashinori's room. He found what he was looking for immediately. A white t-shirt. Surely Tashinori wouldn't mind. It would practically be a nightgown on Izuku anyway. With his sleep-addled mind's approval, Izuku headed to the shower. The water was warm and Izuku just stood under the spray for a long time, letting the heat seep into his sore muscles. The soap and shampoo smelled like Tashinori, and Izuku felt something hot coil in his stomach at the thought that he was using Tashinori's things, that he'd smell like Tashinori when he was done. When he finished, Izuku pulled on the white t-shirt. It wasn't as long as Izuku had thought it would be. He must have grown a couple inches over the past couple months. The shirt didn't go to his knees, but rather stopped almost mid-thigh. It still covered him though, so Izuku shrugged, gathered his dirty clothes, and left the bathroom. Tashinori was digging through his closet, probably looking for the spare futon when Izuku entered the bedroom. He looked up from his task briefly, then did a double take. Tashinori seemed to sputter, color flooding his face before he started coughing so violently Izuku thought he might lose a lung. Are you okay? Izuku dropped the clothes he was carrying and rushed to Tashinori's side. But Tashinori held up a hand in a stopping motion, freezing Izuku in place. Fine, Tashinori said between coughs. Izuku's brow creased in worry, but he couldn't do much until Tashinori finally seemed to calm down. His face still looked a little red, probably from all the coughing. Your, that shirt. Izuku blinked. His face flushed. Oh, do you mind? Izuku asked, suddenly feeling foolish. My clothes were dirty and after I showered I didn't think. It's fine. Tashinori assured him quickly, cutting off Izuku's nervous rambling. Let me just. Tashinori got up and collected the clothes Izuku had dropped. I'll just get these in the wash. He hurried out of the room, the search for the spare futon completely forgotten. Izuku looked at the door where Tashinori had disappeared and frowned. Tashinori had left so quickly and after having what seemed to be a pretty bad coughing fit. Izuku eyed the closet. He supposed he could continue the search for the spare futon in Tashinori's stead. Tashinori's bed was large though. Big enough for both Tashinori and Izuku easily. It would be so much easier and so much nicer to just sleep there. Izuku's feet took him to the bed. It looked so comfortable. It probably smelled like Tashinori. And Izuku was so tired. Izuku flopped down onto the bed. He rolled over onto his back and it was a fight to keep from just falling asleep immediately. Izuku heard Tashinori's footsteps in the hall. I put your clothes in the wash. It shouldn't take long for them to dry in the morning. Tashinori stopped in his tracks at the room entrance. Tashinori's blue eyes were wide as he stared at Izuku, as they took in the image of Izuku laid out on his bed with half-lidded eyes. In the back of Izuku's mind he thought maybe he was pushing a little too hard. Although at the moment Izuku wasn't sure what it was he was pushing exactly. You don't want the futon? Tashinori asked. His voice sounded higher than normal, almost a little distressed. We can share, Izuku suggested. Toshinori didn't seem so sure though. It's fine, Izuku told him tiredly. Because we have something stronger than blood that binds us, right? And he smiled at Toshinori, warm and easy. There wasn't anything Toshinori could say to that, it seemed. To emphasize the fact, Izuku scooted over and shifted to get himself under the covers before he patted the empty space on the bed next to him. Toshinori looked torn. Izuku didn't understand why. Finally, after what seemed like at least 5 minutes of warring with himself, Toshinori tentatively came towards the bed and got under the covers next to Izuku. He changed into sleepwear while Izuku had been in the shower, it seemed. Toshinori's whole body was tense, and he stayed firmly on his side of the bed. Izuku frowned, his chest aching uncomfortably. Is this not okay? Izuku asked quietly, starting to feel a little guilty because he was pretty sure he was making Toshinori uncomfortable. Toshinori looked dismayed, swallowed. Are you comfortable with this? Toshinori's question was almost a whisper, and his eyes searched Izuku's face. Izuku gave it a little bit of thought. No, Izuku decided. Toshinori blinked, the tension in his shoulders sharpening. Before Toshinori could say anything though, or attempt to move, Izuku wedged himself beside Toshinori, resting his head on his chest. Now I am. He grinned just a little cheekily. Toshinori seemed shocked at first, then snorted and laughed before pulling Izuku closer, hugging him. He switched off the bedside lamp, leaving them in the dark. Izuku would have immediately fallen asleep, but there was one more thing on his mind. He'd already pushed for so much, he might as well see how much he could get. Hey, Toshinori? Izuku began, voice quiet. Toshinori hummed in answer. Could I mean, on the days my mom's working, would it be okay if I? Izuku trailed off, his face felt hot, and he heard Toshinori's heart pick up just a little. He swallowed and pressed on. Could we do this again? Izuku's question hung in the darkness for a long moment. Toshinori let out a shuddering breath. Is that something you want? Toshinori asked lightly. Izuku rolled his eyes, then remembered Toshinori couldn't see. Of course it is, Izuku replied, and he hugged Toshinori closer. He couldn't fathom why Toshinori was being so cautious and careful about this. Then a thought occurred. Unless you don't want me to, he quickly added. Anxiety bubbled in his stomach at the thought that maybe he was forcing too much on Toshinori. I want you here. Toshinori said it like it was a confession, like it meant he was guilty of something. Izuku didn't understand why he sounded that way. I'm glad, Izuku whispered back, his anxiety melting and a smile pulling at his lips. Toshinori's far hand moved to settle on Izuku's head before he started carding through Izuku's hair, slowly, soothingly. Izuku fell asleep in the warmth of Toshinori's embrace. He felt safe, protected, happy. Izuku fell asleep with a smile on his face. The warmth remained, but there was something off. He couldn't feel Toshinori around him. Izuku didn't think he was even laying down anymore. Izuku blinked and found himself standing in a black expanse. It had to be some kind of dream, he supposed. What kind of dream, though? Then he heard it. That deep, rumbling laughter. K-k-k-k. Slowly, Izuku turned and came face to face with the jackal. Yellow eyes stared intently at Izuku. He swallowed and took a step back. The door was just behind him. He could make a run for it. The jackal watched him, but didn't make a move. Will you run again? The jackal asked coolly. Again? Izuku repeated, though his whole body seemed to tingle with the need to run, to get to the door and away from the jackal. But then Izuku remembered that he was supposed to be trying to communicate with the jackal, and right now, well, he was. You've been here many times, the jackal replied, sounding almost bored, almost like it had had this conversation before. Each time you run. Izuku wasn't sure what to think about that. He certainly didn't think he remembered being here before. So go. Leave. The jackal heaved a sigh. And then it turned its back on Izuku. Hey! Izuku said irritably. How dare the jackal turn its back on him? If anyone should be acting flippant and annoyed, it was Izuku, not the jackal. The jackal looked over its shoulder at him. It didn't look impressed. Izuku felt like just walking out, just leaving. The jackal didn't deserve Izuku trying to make a truce. But he'd made a promise to Tashinori. He promised he'd try. So as much as Izuku didn't want to, he walked towards the jackal instead of the door. Then he sat down in front of it. The jackal blinked. "We need to talk." Izuku's words were cold. Final. He refused to be afraid of the jackal, not when it was only him in danger of being hurt. Pain he could handle. Izuku crossed his arms and stared the jackal down. Its golden eyes narrowed. "Then talk," it growled, peeling its lips back to show off sharp bone-white teeth. Tashinori suggested he talk to the jackal. Clear the air. Make a truce. Come to an understanding. Izuku needed to not be afraid of what the jackal might do if let loose. And the only way to not be afraid would be to get to know it better. To learn to trust it. To understand it. Izuku suppressed a shiver. He didn't want to get to know it or understand it. But he'd promised he'd try. So fine. He would. Izuku started at the beginning. At what had started Izuku's fear to begin with. "Why'd you do it?" Izuku asked, voice quiet but eyes hard. The jackal blinked slowly, waiting for Izuku to elaborate. "Why'd you hurt Mom?" It was a harsh whisper of a question, but it made the jackal flinch. It looked away. "You're not running," the jackal murmured. "You're avoiding the question." Izuku shot back. The jackal snarled. Izuku crossed his arms, waited. The jackal's shoulders hunched, and it ground its teeth. "It was the first time I had control," the jackal began, its voice quieter than Izuku ever remembered it being. "Mother was proud. I wanted to play." It shrugged a little helplessly. It didn't meet Izuku's eyes. "I knew not Mother's hide was so weak." "An accident?" Izuku asked, feeling the anger in him burn hot. "That's it. You scarred her for life, and all you have to say is that it was an accident." Izuku wasn't sure how to feel at its admission. The jackal seemed ashamed. It really did. It seemed sorry for what had happened. But how it felt couldn't change what had happened. Did the fact that the jackal felt remorse for its actions change anything? Should it? The jackal said it was an accident. Did it deserve forgiveness then? Izuku wasn't sure he could give it, not when he'd lived in fear of it for so long. "You act as though I relish the pain of others," the jackal hissed, eyes flashing and teeth bared. It almost looked ready to pounce at him. "I do not. You seemed to be enjoying it when you attacked Shiso," Izuku hissed back. His stomach rolled at the memory of the feel of his claws sinking into Shinsu's arms. "It was a fight," the jackal growled back. "And that one had locked you away, taken you. I was trying to free you." Izuku gave a bark of mirthless laughter. "You would be happy to be rid of me," he said bitterly. "I'm the only one preventing you from just doing as you please, from attacking anyone that so much as looks at you funny." "Lies," the jackal spat. "I protect us when you run and hide from the world." It glowered darkly. "Coward!" Izuku flinched. "If you'd let me out, I would have kept him from hurting us all those years." "Him." The jackal meant Kaken. Izuku sucked in a breath, his face screwing up in indignation. "You would have killed him," Izuku murmured. "I couldn't let you do that." "I would not have killed," the jackal returned angrily. "I have no desire to kill." "What about at the USJ?" Izuku snapped. He still wasn't sure what all had happened, but he knew what he'd woken up to. The jackal snarled in response. "It tried to kill us and was created with the purpose of killing our mate," the jackal hissed darkly. "That doesn't—" Izuku broke off, his brain suddenly short-circuiting. "Wait. Hold on. Mate?" Izuku startled as he realized what the jackal had said. "Our mate." Shigaraki had said the Numa was created with the purpose of destroying All Might, Tashinori. The jackal had just referred to Tashinori as our mate. A blush creeped up Izuku's neck into his hairline. Back when his quirk had first manifested, even though he swore not to use it, he still researched the type of creature his mother had seen. The Jackal. And Izuku remembered quite well that jackals were monogamous. They chose a single mate. Apparently it had chosen Tashinori. Did Tashinori know? No, no way he knew. He would have said something. There was just no way he knew. And there was no way Izuku was going to tell him either. Part of him realized that if he was ever going to start utilizing the Jackal again, it would inevitably spend a good amount of time with Tashinori. So it would probably be a good idea to let Tashinori know the Jackal's thoughts on their relationship. But no, just the thought of having that conversation was enough to make Izuku want to bury his head in his hands forever. The Jackal eyed him, suspicious of Izuku's sudden silence. Izuku shook his head, clearing his thoughts. You see, can't call Tashinori that. Izuku told it as firmly as he could. The Jackal snorted and rolled its eyes. Anyway. Izuku cleared his throat, looked away. He felt a little jealous actually. Izuku wasn't entirely sure why. The Jackal watched him warily. Its body was tense, clearly Izuku's questions were agitating it. But it wasn't attacking. That was something. The Jackal scoffed. You wanted to talk. The Jackal reminded him flatly. Izuku let out a sigh and scrubbed a hand over his face. They weren't even really talking, they just evolved into shouting angrily at one another. Of course, Izuku realized with mild shame that it was his fault. He'd started hurling accusations. No, he just asked for explanations for the Jackal's behavior. We're not getting anywhere like this, Izuku murmured. The Jackal raised a single dark brow. Izuku let out another long breath. I can't trust you. That's the problem, he explained quietly. If I can't trust you, then I don't feel safe letting you out. So? The Jackal gave snort. You have never trusted me. It grinned feral. You use me when you must? When you see reason? That's the problem, Izuku repeated, frowning. I tried to control you, to use your power without your say. The Jackal shrugged as though Izuku's words were immaterial. Izuku bit his lip, chewed on it as he thought. The Jackal didn't deserve his honesty, but this wasn't just about the Jackal. This was about both of them. They needed to come to some kind of agreement. Tashinori was right. I've always thought of you as an animal, Izuku admitted. The Jackal let out a growl of annoyance. But you're not. Not really. The Jackal blinked. You're sentient. A being of your own. Living in Izuku's body, but that was neither here nor there. Izuku sighed and ran a hand through his hair. Our relationship can't be about control. Izuku hesitated, then pressed on. It needs to be a partnership. The Jackal stared at him, its golden eyes wide. It obviously hadn't expected Izuku's words. The question was how the partnership should be formed. I think we need some ground rules, Izuku suggested, and a feeling of nervousness returned. The Jackal inclined its head. Right. No, killing. I don't. Swear to me that you won't, Izuku said loudly, talking over the Jackal. Fine. The Jackal glowered. Swear you won't hurt anyone. The Jackal balked. If we're in danger, or our mate is in danger, then we decide together at that time whether hurting someone is necessary, Izuku said sharply. He paused, worried his lip between his teeth. I've never really tried, but we can communicate, can't we, when I'm using your power? The Jackal didn't answer, but its frown and narrowed eyes were assent enough. We talk about it then. Okay? The Jackal snorted. Fine. You can't. Izuku took a breath. You can't try to take control from me. We have to decide together whether to transform. I don't want you just doing whatever you want when I'm in the dark. Fair enough, the Jackal replied dryly. And Izuku began. He knew he had to offer something, because if he gave the Jackal nothing, then there wouldn't be any incentive to cooperate. Izuku cleared his throat. When I call on you, normally I just use your power and shove your whispers and everything else away. Golden eyes watched him bright with a spark of interest as the Jackal waited for Izuku to continue. Izuku swallowed. He hoped this wasn't a bad idea. What if we shared? Shared? The jackal repeated, brow furrowing. If we shared control, in your form and even when it's just me I'll try to listen, more. Izuku trailed off feeling foolish. He wasn't even sure that was possible, or if it would be that much worse having only partial control. You'd let me have control even in your own form? The jackal asked, its tone indecipherable. To an extent, Izuku stammered. He clenched his fists to keep from fidgeting. It is a deal. The jackal grinned widely and extended a clawed hand. Izuku stared at the thickly dark-furred claw-like hand. He swallowed before reaching out and taking it. The jackal's grip was strong and binding. Izuku hoped he hadn't made a mistake. Deal, Izuku said with a short nod. The jackal released his hand and Izuku had to force himself to keep from wiping it on his pants. It would probably offend the jackal if he did that. Then they stood in the darkness just looking at each other for a long moment. Izuku had kind of expected to just wake up when it was over, but he hadn't. His eyes were drawn towards the door. Can you feel it? The jackal asked, eyes searching, eyes bright with something. What? Izuku blinked. One for all? Sometimes I guess when I let you out, Izuku answered. He could remember the feel of the bright power, a veritable sun to the jackal's dark cold power. There's more to one for all than what we've used, the jackal told him, and it sounded smug, maybe? What do you mean? Izuku asked, brow furrowing. One for all was a stockpile quirk, incredible powerful sure, but what more was there? The jackal nodded its head and led Izuku towards the door. Except, suddenly it was two doors. One the metal door Izuku himself had built, clawed and scarred by the jackal, and the other was a pristine white. There was a warmth radiating from it, calming, soothing, reminding Izuku of Tashinori's presence. With a gesture from the jackal, Izuku approached and slowly pushed the white door open. Izuku's breath caught at the sight. The light was almost blinding, brilliant and pure. Power rolled off of the core in waves that pressed against Izuku like a warm breeze. It was powerful, but it was kind. But there, as Izuku's eyes adjusted, there was more to the bright white core of power. Izuku thought he could see figures inside, 7 of which held cores of their own, each colored just a little. The first figure held a core of white so similar to the burning power of one for all Izuku almost couldn't distinguish it. It was beautiful, a network of power through 8 different figures. One of the figures looked wispy though, not fully there. Touch one, the jackal suggested. Izuku startled. Is that a good idea? Izuku asked as he felt the raw power emanating even from several feet away. It won't hurt you. The jackal nodded towards it again. Izuku frowned, but took a step forward, then another. He reached out first towards the wispy figure, the one that kind of reminded him of Tashinori, but the jackal stopped him. Not that one. Izuku shot the jackal an annoyed look but moved to reach out to the figure next to the wispy one. The ghost-like figure reminded him of a woman, and as he reached out and touched the core she held he had a flash, a memory, a realization. They're quirks! Izuku gasped, eyes widening and mouth dropping open. The jackal hummed in agreement. He could feel it, the power called float. Izuku couldn't believe it. But how? But the answer was readily apparent. One for all was a stockpile quirk, so how could it possibly be transferred unless the original user had a transference quirk? But naturally, using a transference quirk ought to transfer that transference quirk along with the stockpile, which meant any quirk a user of one for all had would automatically be passed on to the next wielder. And that meant... How many? Izuku asked the jackal, eyes still wide as he contemplated what this meant. The original transference quirk, the stockpile, and 6 others. The jackal replied. Float was one of those 6. That's amazing, crazy, inconceivable. Izuku wasn't sure what he could even say. The jackal chuckled at Izuku's reaction. How long have you known? When you locked me away for so long I had time to explore. The jackal shrugged non-committal. Sometimes they talk too. What? Izuku asked, turning his head sharply to try to gauge what the jackal meant. The ghosts of One for All, the previous holders. They talk? Izuku repeated dumbly. Sometimes. This was the jackal's way of offering peace. Just as Izuku had offered a deal, the jackal had offered the only thing it could think of, knowledge. Izuku swallowed thickly and stared at the core of power, the ghostly figures that each held a quirk of their own. With a gasp, Izuku realized he should be able to tap into them, to use those quirks. The question was how. Toshi had forgotten to set his alarm the previous evening, so he awoke only when the sunlight began filtering in through the blinds in his room. Toshi couldn't remember ever sleeping as well as he had. Not in all his life, really. Even now he felt so warm and comfortable he would have just gone back to sleep, except that now there was sun in his eyes. Reluctantly, Toshi blinked his eyes open, squinting against the light. That was when he noticed his blanket felt heavier than normal. Not in a bad way, but just not like he remembered. As his eyes adjusted, he realized it wasn't his blanket, and the events of the previous day rushed into the forefront of his mind. Oh. Right. Shit. Yesterday Toshi had let Izuku come over to stay the night. Toshi had shared his bed with Midoriya. He'd been so torn on what to do, how to handle the situation. He wanted Midoriya to be happy and taken care of, but somehow he'd ended up in a situation like this. Izuku had fallen asleep curled up against Toshi's side with an arm thrown across Toshi's body. But somehow Izuku had managed to get half on top of Toshi in the night. One of Toshi's legs was now held tightly between both of Izuku's, and Izuku's head was pillowed on the center of Toshi's chest. Izuku's hands clutched tightly to Toshi's shirt. The young man was still sleeping, his expression so peaceful. Toshi smiled and ran a hand through his green hair before he reminded himself that he should not in any way be enjoying this. He also realized quite suddenly that all Izuku was wearing was one of his t-shirts. And it had sort of ridden up just a little. He could feel it against his leg. A flush spread across Toshi's face as his mind raced to find the answer to the question of what to do now. But did he need to do anything? Toshi reminded himself that what he was feeling wasn't what he thought. Just as Nedza had said, this wasn't attraction or love, this was just feeling close to Izuku. Midoriya. Young Midoriya. Letting out a shuddering breath, Toshi decided he didn't need to feel panicked, or like he was doing something wrong. Because he wasn't. He wouldn't. Forcing himself to relax, Toshi tried to slow his quickening heart. He didn't want to wake Midoriya, after all. Toshi let himself wrap his arms around Midoriya and hold him tight. He could indulge just a little, right? It was fine like this. Midoriya stirred and Toshi loosened his grip. Green eyes snapped open. For a moment, Midoriya seemed confused, then he seemed to remember where he was. His head tilted so he could see Toshi. He gave the young man a small smile, hoping Midoriya wouldn't panic like he had at realizing their position. He didn't panic. Not at all. Instead, Midoriya's eyes brightened, and then he was pushing himself up so he could look down at Toshi before opening his mouth and speaking so fast Toshi could barely catch a word or two. Italkatoth the Jackal, and Mady and Agreement Tandakan believe Adida Tandai Tevan agreed and we see tout grounder listened. Toshi blinked. From what he could gather, Midoriya had successfully spoken with the Jackal. But other than that, Toshi wasn't sure what Midoriya was saying. But the young man was smiling so brightly, so happily, and a blush crept higher in Toshi's face. When Midoriya had moved, he had inadvertently changed their position so that he was now straddling Toshi, propped up by his arms against Toshi's chest, and their faces only a few inches apart now. Midoriya was still talking, but Toshi couldn't exactly focus. From the way Midoriya's legs were splayed, the t-shirt rode up even further and Toshi could feel. No. He wasn't going to think about what he was feeling pressed against him, or how his own body was starting to react. Except Midoriya would soon feel it himself. Or maybe he wouldn't, with how excited and preoccupied he was with his mutterings. But Toshi couldn't let this keep going. Izuku, Toshi bit out, realizing too late he'd used his first name. Izuku's mouth snapped shut, his eyes wide. Could you? Toshi pushed lightly against Midoriya's shoulders in a feeble effort to push him off. Even though that was the furthest from what he wanted to do just then. Izuku's eyes widened further, and a flush spread across his face. Then he was scrambling back and off of him. Toshi was quick to sit up and angle himself away from Midoriya. There was a squeak from Midoriya, and Toshi turned to see that, in his haste, Midoriya had tripped over the blanket and fallen back onto the bed. Toshi's face felt like it was on fire, and his eyes were as wide as they could go. The t-shirt was still bunched up by Midoriya's hips. Whipping back around, Toshi mumbled an apology before fleeing from the room as fast as he could. Well, at least now he knew Midoriya was definitely a male. And that the Jackal had lied. Or more likely, it was just very, very confused. Midoriya had only one part, and it was the part that Toshi had keenly felt pressed against his leg and then lower stomach. He locked himself in the bathroom. Splashing cold water on his face, he tried to figure out what to do next. Toshi's body still felt hot, his face still red, and his lower half was, well, still reacting. Toshi was painfully hard. Waking up with a half-naked Izuku was bad enough, but then having him straddle him and everything, well, Toshi was having a tough time getting some of those images out of his head. His right hand twitched at his side. He could take care of it. It wasn't like he hadn't done that before. A long time ago, sure, but he knew how. Toshi knew it wouldn't take much. He would barely have to do anything. His body was already so hot and ready. The image of Izuku in nothing but his button-down shirt, looking up at him with bright green doe eyes, flashed through his mind. Toshi shook his head, banishing the image. It was replaced by the memory of Izuku in nothing but Toshi's white t-shirt, the edges riding up along his freckled thighs. No. No way. It would be wrong. So very, very wrong. Toshi wasn't going to do that. He wasn't going to think of Izuku, young Midoriya, that way. His hands trembled, but he made what he could only deem the right decision. Instead of reaching for his throbbing length, he grasped the shower handle and turned it on as cold as it would go. He stepped out of his sleep clothes and into the freezing water and tried to cool off his body and his mind. The guilt was starting to eat at him now. What would Midoriya think of him if he knew? No. Toshi just had to remember that it wasn't what he thought. His body was mistaken. Misplacing emotions and labeling them wrong. That's all. Toshi thought the more he told himself that, the easier it would be, but he was finding just the opposite. No matter how many times he reminded his body it was mistaken, the emotions seemed to multiply. It was the cold water rather than his own denial that finally cooled his body off. The first thing Toshi did when he left the bathroom was get Midoriya's clothes in the dryer. The sooner the young man had his clothes back on, the sooner Toshi would feel less like there was something severely wrong with him. He repeated over and over that he was wrong. His feelings weren't what they seemed. Just as Nezu had said. Nothing to be ashamed of, because nothing had happened and nothing would happen. On his way to the kitchen, Toshi turned the television on. It was already set to a news station. Toshi heard Midoriya come into the living room, heard him stand there waiting for Toshi to look at him. He didn't. He couldn't. Then he heard Midoriya's sharp intake of breath, and Toshi had to look up to see what had happened. Midoriya was still standing there, but his gaze was on the television. His eyes were wide and looked horrified. Toshi followed his gaze. There'd been an attack in ᴡᴇ'ʟᴟ. Lots and lots of ᴡᴇ'ʟ. And the hero killer Stain. The pro-hero native had been killed. A student from UA had been injured, but luckily the pro-hero Endeavor had been patrolling ᴡᴇ'ʟ and had stopped Stain from killing the student. The student was ᴛᴏ from Class 1A. Midoriya's friend. Toshi didn't make the conscious decision to walk to Midoriya's side, but he found himself there nevertheless. He did choose to place a comforting hand on his shoulder. Midoriya's face was white, and he was muttering something. Something about how he knew something like this would happen, how he should have tried harder to stop Ida, that he should have checked on him. "He's all right, Midoriya," Toshi told him quietly. The reporter had said Ida was injured but alive. They didn't say how injured, but that didn't matter at the moment. What mattered was that Ida was alive. Midoriya was still staring at the television though, watching the images of the alley where the battle between Stain and Endeavor had been. There were blood stains on the concrete. Toshi moved to stand in front of Midoriya, obscuring the screen. Toshi pulled Midoriya to him, wrapping his arms around him loosely, giving Midoriya the chance to pull away if he wanted to. He didn't. Instead, Midoriya clung to him, his small frame trembling slightly. Yesterday everything had been normal, great even. Almost like a dream. Today was like waking up. For Izuku, the day before had been like a dream. A wonderful dream. Meeting with the Jackal was, not exactly pleasant, but not unpleasant. And then waking up with Toshinori had been lovely. The warmth, the comfort, and he tried to share the good news with Toshinori about the Jackal, about their deal. But something had happened. Izuku hadn't meant to position himself the way he had, and he'd forgotten that all he'd been wearing was Toshi's t-shirt. They'd ended up in a kind of intimate position. Izuku hadn't actually noticed until Toshi choked out his name. His first name. The feeling that ignited low in Izuku's belly at hearing Toshinori say his name, and say it the way he did, Izuku couldn't name. But it wasn't a bad feeling. Not at all. But then, of course, Izuku had screwed everything up. He'd panicked and tried to give Toshinori space, and then tripped. Izuku had hit his head on the wall, and by the time he sat up Toshinori was gone. But the shirt he'd been wearing wasn't exactly covering him anymore. Izuku had fretted for quite some time while Toshinori was in the bathroom. He'd convinced himself that Toshinori hadn't seen anything, that he'd left before he did. But when Izuku came out of the bedroom, Toshinori didn't look up at him at all. His face was a little flushed though. So Izuku had a feeling Toshinori had, in fact, seen everything. And that had made Izuku internally panic about what to do. Nothing got resolved though, because then Izuku had seen the news. Ida. Toshinori had held him, rubbed his back and told him it would be okay. Still, Izuku felt so awful about the whole thing. He sent a message to Ida, asking if he was okay. It took 30 minutes before Ida responded that he was fine and just got out of surgery. Izuku was worried nonetheless. Then he'd had to head home. Toshinori had offered to walk him, but Izuku had declined. He now knew Toshinori had almost certainly seen everything, from the waist down, which was the important area, so Izuku couldn't help feeling embarrassed. A little time apart should help him figure things out. Or at least that was the idea. "I'm home!" Izuku called as he opened the apartment door and stepped inside. He slid off his shoes and headed towards his room. As he passed the living room though, he saw his mother sitting on the couch looking worried. When she saw him she stood. "You're back." She tried to smile, but it was weak. I texted you." Izuku pulled out his phone to check, and he had indeed sent her a message yesterday that he was staying with a friend. "You did," she acknowledged. Izuku frowned, not sure why she seemed so concerned then. "You were with Yagi-san, weren't you?" his mother asked lightly. "That's the friend you stayed with last night." "Yes," Izuku answered. There was no reason to lie, and he didn't want to lie, not to his mother, not again. But there was something about the way she asked that made Izuku feel defensive. "I asked him if I could," Izuku added. "It was my choice." That seemed very important right now, that Izuku had been the one to ask if he could stay with Toshinori. His mother's lips thinned and she looked a bit dismayed, a bit worried, but not angry. "What's wrong?" Izuku asked. He racked his brain trying to understand why his mother was frowning. "You like him," he reminded her. I do," she agreed, but she was still frowning. She hesitated. "How?" she began but bit her lip, then started again. "How do you feel about Yagi-san?" Her question was so soft, so tentative that Izuku knew there was more meaning behind it. "I like Toshi, Yagi-san," Izuku replied carefully, not sure where his mother was going with this. "He's great." His mother's brow just creased further. Sure, Izuku had a crush on All Might. But after getting to know Toshinori, his feelings just weren't the same. It was different. He felt happy and safe with Toshinori. They were closer than family. His heart ached when Toshinori looked sad and an unknown heat coiled in his belly when his eyes met Izuku's, when he smiled. Izuku wasn't sure what to label what he felt, but he knew it wasn't a crush. If anything, it felt a lot like he imagined love. "You call him Toshi?" It was a soft murmur, not meant for Izuku's ears, but he heard it. He heard how worried she sounded. It bothered Izuku, how worried she seemed, and not because he didn't want her to worry. She continued before he could say anything. "And how does he feel about you?" Izuku blinked. "Huh!" The unintelligible non-word tumbled from his lips as he tilted his head in question. "I mean, he likes me, I guess?" Izuku rubbed at the back of his neck, felt his heart clench. Toshinori wouldn't have let him stay at his home, or made him his successor if he didn't like Izuku. Actually, Toshinori had told him that he liked him. "He seems like such a good guy," his mother assured, though whether she was assuring herself or Izuku he wasn't sure. "He seems like he cares about you a lot. He told me he'd never hurt you." She trailed off, worried her lip between her teeth again. "He wouldn't," Izuku told her firmly. "He hasn't." He was starting to feel a bit dismayed himself. "Mom, what is it?" At first I thought you must have thought of him as a father figure, since your own father isn't around," she said quietly. "Father figure? No. That wasn't it at all." Izuku could never think of Toshinori as his father. Just the thought made Izuku feel uncomfortable. But his mother continued. "But then I saw the way you looked at him, when he came for dinner. He's my mentor. My friend." Izuku tried, but knew his explanation wasn't enough. It didn't even feel enough for Izuku. "Is that all it is?" she asked. "I tried to convince myself that was all it was, but what?" Izuku demanded, hating how his voice sounded shriller than normal. "I like him and he likes me. We're friends. That's it." His mother looked a little shocked by his outburst. Izuku let out a shaky breath. He ran a hand through his hair. He felt restless. "Stop trying to make it out like it's something wrong," Izuku said, softer this time. "It's not." His mother still looked worried, but she seemed to accept his words or at least realize they weren't going to get anywhere. "Okay," she said finally. It was after his mother left for work that Izuku decided he had lied a little. He didn't like Toshinori. He really liked him. He liked him as much as it was possible to like someone. Izuku didn't let himself go any further than that. If he did, he wasn't sure he'd be able to keep it to himself or allow things to continue on the way they were. Izuku sighed and laid down to sleep. He needed to get some rest. Final exams would start soon. "You can't put them together." Aizawa looked up at Toshi with a tired and slightly annoyed expression. He didn't answer though, just blinked slowly. Toshi frowned at the lack of reaction. "Young Midoriya and Bakugo," Toshi clarified, realizing a little late that Aizawa might not know what he was talking about. "You can't team them together for the exam. They're my students," Aizawa replied, though he didn't sound angry or determined in his decision. Instead, it seemed he was offering Toshi a chance to explain his reasoning. "There's a history between them," Toshi told him. "Bad history," he emphasized. "Bakugo's been getting counseling from hound dogs since the second day of school," Aizawa replied. Toshi blinked. He hadn't known that. It didn't change anything, though. "I suppose you don't like that you've been picked as their proctor either?" "No," Toshi shook his head. "That doesn't bother me." Aizawa arched a single black brow. As much as Aizawa didn't seem to believe it, Toshi had no problem fighting Midoriya or Bakugo. He was pretty sure he could get Midoriya to use the Jackal even if he was still hesitant about using it. The problem was, but those two shouldn't be alone together. Whether Bakugo's been getting help or not, it's too soon. Aizawa was quiet for a moment, thinking. "What kind of history?" Aizawa finally asked, but it seemed from his expression he already had a pretty good idea. "Bullying," Toshi said. The word left a bad taste in his mouth. "Probably for years," I'm not sure how long or the extent. But based on the bruises and burns he'd seen, it was probably pretty bad. Izawa nodded as though it was what he'd expected. Expected? Why did Izawa seem unsurprised by this information? Was he just that observant? Or, why is Bakugo receiving counseling? Toshi asked. He suddenly felt a little on edge, a little worried about the answer. For a moment Toshi thought Izawa wouldn't answer, or would tell him it wasn't his business. Except it was to the extent that Bakugo was his student as well. There was an accident with his quirk on the second day of school, Izawa said at last. Toshi felt his face pale. What kind of accident? He pressed. Izawa eyed him wearily, as though he was worried Toshi might do something. Sighing, Izawa raked a hand through his black hair, and then scrubbed a hand over his face, rubbing some of the sleep out of his eyes. It's been handled, all might, Izawa told him quietly. What kind of accident? Toshi asked again, tone clipped. He already had a pretty good idea, but he needed to hear it, needed to know if it was actually an accident or not. Izawa frowned, but answered. Midoriya said they got into an argument, he began, his eyes tired but keen. Bakugo grabbed Midoriya's wrist at some point and his quirk went off. Toshi's eyes widened. It wasn't as bad as what he had imagined, but it still was pretty bad. Was he okay? Toshi asked, hating that Midoriya had been hurt like that. Izawa sighed. Midoriya's wrist was burned pretty badly, Izawa said with a shrug. Nothing Recovery Girl couldn't handle, and it healed well. No scarring. How did you find out? Toshi asked. Midoriya had been so closed off when Toshi had brought up the subject of bullying. The idea that Midoriya willingly told Recovery Girl or Izawa stabbed at Toshi, the thought that Midoriya thought they were more trustworthy than him. Bakugo brought him to the infirmary, Izawa said, surprising Toshi. He admitted to it. Said it was the first time his quirk had activated on accident. Toshi frowned. That meant all those other burns Midoriya had gotten were all purposeful. Bakugo as good as admitted it with a statement like that. But then, Midoriya never told anyone about those and Bakugo never confessed to those. This incident, though, Izawa said it happened on the second day of school. That was a long time ago. Why didn't you tell me? Toshi asked, a feeling of anger sparking in him though he kept it down. He had no reason to be mad at Izawa, and really he wasn't. He was mad at Bakugo and he was hurt that Midoriya hadn't told him. There wasn't a need to, Izawa answered. Wasn't a need to? Toshi repeated, balking at the notion. Of course there was a need to. Midoriya is my... Toshi's words died on his lips as he realized he wasn't quite sure what he was about to say, to admit. Izawa was sharp though and picked up on it immediately. He's your what? Izawa asked, expression darkening as he stood up to face Toshi. He was still shorter than Toshi, but somehow Izawa still managed to seem bigger. Go ahead. Finish your sentence. Any anger Toshi had left drained from him and he looked away, not able to meet Izawa's eyes. He's my student, Toshi answered. That wasn't what you were going to say, Izawa stated rather than asked, his voice hard. No, it wasn't what he was going to say. Midoriya was his successor. But no, that wasn't it either really. Toshi shook his head. It wasn't like that though. Whatever he thought he felt it wasn't what he thought. He's my friend. It was the best he could do and all he could offer an explanation. Izawa sighed, his dark anger fading into light irritation. He's your student first, Izawa told him. You need to remember that. All Toshi could do was nod. Izawa was right after all. Still, Toshi continued, they shouldn't be paired together, Midoriya and Bakugo. I paired them together so they would be forced to work together, forced to confront and hopefully resolve some of their issues, Izawa said, scrubbing a hand over his face. He seemed to think for a moment. Is Midoriya still refusing to use his quirk? He's still hesitant about using the Jackal, but if push comes to shove I think he'd do the right thing, Toshi answered. Izawa hummed as he considered, then a cat-like grin spread across his face. What? Toshi asked, not sure he really wanted to know the answer. I have someone else who I think will pair well with him. Izuku looked for his name on the list. He was paired with Shudo Todoroki, and they were going up against Aizawa-sensei. Izuku swallowed. Well, at least he wasn't paired with Kaken. That would not have gone well. He felt sorry for Yaoyorozu, but then, Kaken would probably treat her better than he did Izuku. Hopefully. Izuku hadn't spoken with Todoroki a whole lot. He knew he was a good student, and very serious. His quirk, of course, but that was about it. Still, Izuku decided to approach him to see if he was willing to discuss a plan. Hi Todoroki. Izuku greeted, sounding just as awkward as he felt. Todoroki just blinked at him. So, I guess we're paired for the exam. Let's go, everyone. Aizawa-sensei called. Each pair will be bus to your exam site. Izuku blanched a little. He thought they'd have some time to plan, but Aizawa-sensei was already directing them to the buses. Aizawa-sensei was on the bus with Todoroki and Izuku since he was their proctor. Izuku wasn't sure it was a good idea to try to talk about their plan when their proctor was right there. Even if it looked like Aizawa-sensei was sleeping, Izuku knew he was a shrewd enough hero to still somehow be paying attention. So the bus ride to their exam site was quiet and awkward. It wasn't until the exam began that they got a chance to talk about their plan. We should split up, Todoroki said as they carefully walked the narrow streets in the direction of one of the exits. What? Izuku blurted, confused. Todoroki had won the sports festival, he was a top student, Izuku had expected him to want to fight. Aizawa-sensei will erase my quirk before I get the chance to use it, but I should be able to keep him busy long enough for you to find the exit. What? Izuku said again, this time he felt a flare of annoyance. Todoroki gave him a blank look. Out of the two of us, I'm more dangerous to Aizawa-sensei. Todoroki explained. Izuku did not agree with that assessment at all, but that was neither here nor there. He'll go after me first anyway. You're small and quick, you shouldn't have a problem finding an exit. What happens if he catches you faster than you anticipated and then goes after me? Izuku asked, trying to keep from sounding petulant. Then we'll fail. He pointed out, not giving Todoroki a chance to respond. Splitting up was almost never a good idea in Izuku's opinion. Todoroki frowned but didn't say anything. Whether he was thinking or just dismissing his point, Izuku wasn't sure. It felt like a good chunk of time passed as they made their way towards the exit together without seeing Aizawa-sensei even once. The silence was getting a little oppressive. What are you to All Might? Todoroki asked suddenly. He kept his voice quiet, almost a whisper. What? Izuku stammered, eyes widening. Todoroki glanced back at him. He looked curious, like it was a question he'd wanted to ask for a while but had never gotten the chance. At the USJ your quirk, it called All Might its mate. Todoroki told Izuku flatly. Izuku's whole face turned crimson as he stammered his response. My quirk's just confused. It's not like that at all. Izuku quickly denied whatever Todoroki was implying. But wait. The Jackal had called All Might its mate at the USJ? When? Did it declare it when it took down the ᴛᴏ? How many of his classmates knew? Izuku didn't get a chance to ask Todoroki any of his questions. You should be paying attention to your surroundings, not chatting. Aizawa-sensei appeared out of nowhere, his capture scarf lancing towards them. Izuku lunged to the side, tackling Todoroki out of the way. They rolled on the concrete street before skidding to a halt. Izuku was on his feet faster, but Todoroki was close behind. Todoroki raised his right hand. Nothing happened. He cursed. Aizawa-sensei's quirk made both of their quirks useless. Izuku grit his teeth as his mind raced. He couldn't use his quirk as long as he was within Aizawa-sensei's line of sight. But his teacher was being careful to keep both of them in his field of vision. There was no chance he could get behind him. Maybe Izuku could still obscure his vision though. Izuku's eyes frantically scanned the narrow street. Mostly concrete. But there were some shrubs. There was dirt. Izuku dove to the side, avoiding another one of Izuku-sensei's attempts to catch him with the capture scarf, but also moving himself closer to Izuku-sensei. It also took him closer to the shrubs. Izuku grabbed 2 fistfuls of dirt, pivoted and threw one of them right at Izuku-sensei's face. Their teacher jerked back. His goggles protected his eyes, but the sheet of dirt obscured his vision long enough for his quirk to be useless for just a second. "Todoroki," Izuku called, hoping he'd understand as Izuku threw his other fistful of dirt at Izuku-sensei. Luckily, Todoroki got the idea. The second Izuku-sensei's line of sight was broken. Todoroki created an ice wall between them. Then they ran. Todoroki sent wave after wave of ice behind them as they ran, creating more barriers between them. The problem, of course, they realized, when they finally put enough distance between them and stopped to catch their breaths, was that they'd been forced to run further away from the exit. They needed a plan. Izuku-sensei would catch up with them soon and they were running out of time. Todoroki turned and fixed Izuku with a determined expression. "You need to transform before Izuku-sensei finds us again," Todoroki told him. Izuku blinked, confused. How his transformation would help against Izuku-sensei made no sense to Izuku. Izuku-sensei would just erase his quirk anyway. Todoroki gave him a flat look, apparently guessing Izuku's thoughts. At the USJ, Izuku-sensei used his quirk on you and it had no effect, Todoroki said dryly, as though Izuku should already be well aware of the fact. Izuku's eyes widened. "Ah, really?" Then he frowned. "But during the sports festival it clearly did work, so I don't see how." "Does it matter?" Todoroki asked, sounding just a little irritated. "It's worth a shot, right?" "I guess so." Izuku rubbed at the back of his neck awkwardly. Todoroki mistook his confusion and awkwardness for hesitance. "Are you really not using it? Your quirk?" Todoroki asked, causing Izuku to blink in surprise. "What? Since the USJ incident you haven't used your quirk?" "Not at UA anyway, not for classes." Todoroki continued as though Izuku hadn't spoken. "We're not going to be able to pass this exam if you don't." He said it so bluntly, like Izuku was wrong for not using his quirk. Maybe that was true, but coming from Todoroki it annoyed Izuku. "You don't use your fire." Izuku hadn't meant to say it really, but it came out anyway. He'd said it forcefully too, indignantly. At Todoroki's dark look, Izuku almost apologized. "That's my father's power." Todoroki bit out. "I don't need it, his power." And Izuku was suddenly struck with how similar they were. Not exactly the same by any means, but the way they viewed their quirks. Izuku had seen it as evil for a long time. A power he refused to use even to fulfill his dream of becoming a hero. Until Toshinori showed him differently. Until Toshinori told him, "It's your quirk, Todoroki. Your power." Izuku told him firmly. "The power itself isn't evil or bad, it's how you use it. And if you're going to be a hero, then you have to use everything you have to save people." Todoroki stared at him incredulously, opened his mouth to retort, but Izuku didn't give him a chance. "And the Jackal is my power, my quirk. And I will use it." With a breath, Izuku let the Jackal explode out of him in a torrent of black fur, claws, and teeth. It was different this time. Izuku hadn't started a beat, hadn't tried to stay present, but he hadn't felt swept away into the dark either. His vision was sharp, his body felt like his own, though there was a pull to crouch rather than stand straight. Todoroki looked momentarily worried, but then his brow creased like there was something he hadn't seen before. Izuku grinned, his teeth bared and his clawed hands flexing. "Now, let's pass this exam." Izuku could tell they were close. Still, he scaled the building and looked out over the section of the city. The streets were narrow, but there, he saw it. A shadow. He'd found them. Not waiting another second, Izuku leapt down towards them using his capture scarf to slow his descent until he landed in a crouch on the street. He saw Todoroki first. The boy's mismatched eyes widened a fraction and he tried to use his quirk. Too slow. Too late. Izuku didn't see Midoriya, but he figured they'd split up. Use one of them as bait while the other tried to escape. Well, that wasn't going to work out for them. Aizawa was fast. He could tie up Todoroki and still have plenty of time to find and capture Midoriya. Todoroki turned to run. He got around the corner and halfway down the street before Aizawa's capture scarf snared his legs right out from under him. Aizawa made to drag Todoroki towards him but froze when he heard it. A deep, thundering laugh. He knew that laugh. Aizawa threw himself to the side just in time. The jackal landed in the spot right where Aizawa had been. With a single rake of its claws and a burst of green static, the capture scarf was severed. Keeping his quirk active, Aizawa made sure to keep both Todoroki and the jackal in his sights. But just as with the USJ, Midoriya's quirk wasn't erased. The green static faded though, and the jackal made a sound like a snarl in its throat. And then the jackal was on him again, faster than Aizawa could move. It was odd because the jackal's grace and reaction was so fluid, just like at the USJ after Midoriya gave over control, yet still somewhat calculated. Aizawa was thrown to the ground, the jackal crouched over him. And then he saw its face. Its eyes. Its eyes were different. Only one was golden in color. The other green. Sorry about this, Aizawa-sensei. The words were a growl and Aizawa couldn't be sure whether it was Midoriya or the jackal that had spoken. But the one green eye and one golden eye, and the way it sounded both sarcastic and heartfelt, suggested it was both of them. The jackal's or Midoriya's hand came down, covering Aizawa's eyes, breaking his line of sight. Then he felt ice encasing him and then, finally, he felt the handcuffs click around his wrists. Had Aizawa known Midoriya would use his quirk without seemingly any problems, then he would have put him against All Might. As it was, Aizawa supposed the both of them got something out of the practical exam. Learning teamwork if nothing else. Congratulations, Aizawa told them dryly. Todoroki inclined his head, but his gaze lingering on his own left hand thoughtfully. The jackal grinned, both eyes, green and golden, bright and full of hope. Izuku was thrilled about the training camp. It would be a chance to work on using his quirks and maybe even give him a chance to try to figure out the 6 other quirks held within One for All. He'd gotten the chance to tell Toshinori about what the jackal had found before they left. Toshinori in turn had told Izuku about All for One. About the purpose of One for All. Things he really ought to have told Izuku from the beginning. Not that Izuku would ever hold that against him. Toshinori. Izuku was not thrilled to be going to the training camp. It meant a week of not seeing Toshinori because Toshinori wasn't going. Just Aizawa-sensei. Izuku missed Toshinori as soon as he got on the bus, and the journey to the middle of nowhere where the camp would take place gave Izuku plenty of time to realize he probably wouldn't be able to even call him. Especially not with all his classmates around. The jackal wasn't pleased at all. It would have preferred to spend the week with Toshinori. But that wasn't exactly an option. The jackal scoffed at Izuku's reminder that as much as the jackal called Toshinori its mate, it didn't make it so. What was great about the camp was that it was on private land, so they'd be able to use their quirks just like at UA. Aizawa-sensei made them all get off the bus to look out over the vast forest where they'd be spending the next week. When they met the wild pussycats, Izuku got excited. One of the best parts about being a student at UA was meeting all the pro heroes. Even when Aizawa-sensei locked the bus and they were all kicked off the cliff down into the forest, Izuku's day wasn't ruined. What was mildly frustrating was that they were all in their travel clothes. Not even their gym uniforms, let alone their hero costumes. Which wasn't a big deal for most, or any really, of his classmates. It was for Izuku. Frowning, Izuku pulled off his shit and kicked off his shoes. He tried to make a promise to come back for the items, but knew he probably wouldn't. Luckily, he'd been smart enough to bring several spare shoes. Izuku called upon the jackal and his body changed. His shorts stretched and tore slightly, but they stayed on, which was the important thing. Didn't mind having them off with Toshinori. The jackal chuckled and Izuku was glad his fur hid his blush. He told the jackal to shut up but didn't shove it into the dark. They'd made a deal after all. Channeling One for All, Izuku shot forward, allowing the jackal control for most of their movements. The jackal was just more fluid, more used to its own body than Izuku was. During the practical exam, Izuku had been amazed at how graceful the jackal could be. Out of the corner of his eye, Izuku saw Todoroki had started using his fire. It was small and tentative at first, but he was doing it. Izuku felt a wolfish grin spread across his face. None of them made it to the camp before noon. Or even by noon. It was dinner time when they got there. It should have been easy to sleep after all that. But Izuku couldn't fall asleep. He tried. Really, he did. But he stared at the ceiling for about 30 minutes, listening to his classmates snoring softly around him before he realized it just wasn't going to happen. Even the jackal felt restless. Carefully, Izuku got up and went outside. Izuku sat on the wooden porch and looked up at the sky. There were so many more stars than back home. He sighed and took out his phone. No messages. It was only 9. He could still be awake. Tashinori. Yeah, Izuku missed him. He'd become a regular and almost ever-present fixture in Izuku's life since they met. Even on weekends, Izuku would see him sometimes. For training usually. Okay, almost always for training. Still, Izuku could always message him. Do it. Izuku could tell the jackal was grinning. It couldn't hurt anything, right? Just a quick text. Unlocking his phone, Izuku went into the text thread he had with Tashinori. He shouldn't call him in case he was asleep. But maybe a message would be okay. Izuku's thumbs hovered over the screen. He bit his lip. What should he say? The jackal pushed lightly and Izuku resisted at first, just out of habit, before he relaxed and gave the jackal control. It was odd. Being in his own body rather than the jackal's, but not in control. Well, that wasn't exactly true. Izuku felt like he could take back the reins any time. Are you awake? Izuku smiled and snorted a little. Such an innocuous message. For some reason he'd expected the jackal to type something more rough or suggestive, maybe. Izuku hit send. For some reason Izuku's heart started beating faster as he held his phone, waiting to see if he'd get an answer. It was silly, really. In all likelihood Tashinori was asleep and wouldn't see the message until the morning, and Izuku's phone buzzed, the screen lighting up, signaling an incoming call. Izuku almost dropped his phone in his haste to answer. Izuku? Tashinori's voice was so calming, and hearing him say his first name made Izuku's face burn and his breath stutter. Is everything okay? Oh no. He'd made Tashinori think something had happened. No. That wasn't it at all. But he didn't want to think he was messaging him for nothing either. Izuku could hear the jackal laughing at him. Why, yeah. I mean, of course. Everything's fine. I didn't mean to, Izuku stammered, tripping over his words as he tried to make some kind of excuse for why he had messaged him. I didn't mean to wake you up. If you were. Izuku fell silent when he heard Tashinori chuckling. That's quite all right, my boy, he said softly, a note of fondness in his voice. I was awake. Izuku waited, feeling like Tashinori had more to say. Couldn't sleep, he admitted quietly. Me either, Izuku replied quickly, and he felt a swell of emotions, his heart aching. There was a moment of silence. It wasn't awkward, though. Izuku just closed his eyes and listened to Tashinori breathing. How's the training camp? Tashinori asked after a moment's hesitation. With his eyes closed, Izuku could almost pretend they weren't miles apart. Izuku could imagine Tashinori rubbing the back of his neck, a light pink dusting on his cheeks as he spoke. I miss you. Izuku blinked. It took him a moment to realize he was the one who had spoken. That he'd said the words out loud. His face flushed crimson and his mouth fell open. Izuku couldn't seem to speak, though. Mortification flooded him, and he was about to be swept away into the currents of embarrassment for which he would never recover when. I miss you too. It was said so softly and gently Izuku thought maybe he'd just imagined it. But the way Tashinori gave a small cough afterwards suggested he too felt a little embarrassed about the admission. But we'll see each other soon, Tashinori reminded him, and he sounded just a little flustered to Izuku. It's only a week. It felt like forever. Could I? Izuku bit his lip. He was probably overstepping. He shouldn't ask. Tashinori already gave him so much. The jackal pushed out the rest of his words before Izuku couldn't even think to stop it. Could I call you again tomorrow night? I'd like that, Tashinori answered. And it had to have been Izuku's imagination that Tashinori's voice sounded just a little rough. Good night, Izuku. Good night, Tashinori, Izuku whispered back. It didn't occur to Izuku until later that Tashinori had called him by his first name the entire conversation. Izuku didn't have any trouble falling asleep after that. The test of courage. Izuku had never done one before, but it sounded like a lot of fun. Except the lot he drew paired him with Kaken. Of course it did. Kaken tried to switch but Mandalay wouldn't let them. No switching, she told them brightly. She didn't know their history though. They hadn't talked really since the second day of school. That was a while ago. Izuku wasn't sure he wanted to talk either. But then, maybe Kaken didn't either. He hadn't said anything to Izuku. Not even an apology. Not that Izuku really expected one. He wasn't sure what he did expect beyond something other than the glacial silence Kaken was giving him. When it came to their turn, Kaken didn't even look at Izuku before striding purposefully into the forest. Izuku was quick to follow after. He didn't want them to get separated. Not that Kaken seemed to care. They passed a couple students that only sort of freaked Izuku out when the silence between them felt like it was too much. Izuku hesitated in saying anything. He didn't want Kaken to get angry. Who cares? The jackal grumbled. Izuku frowned and tried to convey a flat look to the beast within him. But Kaken apparently picked up on his hesitance, since he stopped just a little ways in front of Izuku. He didn't turn to look at him, but he spoke. You got something to say? Kaken asked gruffly, digging his hands into his pockets. No, I haven't really talked with you since. Izuku trailed off and cringed. He knew it was a mistake to bring up what had happened. How have you been? How have I? Kaken bit off the words and whirled to look at Izuku, who flinched back out of reflex. But Kaken didn't look angry, he looked baffled. What the hell is wrong with you? He demanded. Izuku's mouth fell open, feeling more than a little confused himself. Never mind. He finally settled on. It was his own fault for initiating things. Let's just finish up with the exercise. Kaken's nose flared and his expression turned indignant. For a moment, Izuku thought Kaken might do something, take a step forward or activate his quirk. But then Kaken closed his eyes and breathed deeply, seemingly silently counting each breath. When his eyes snapped back open, he looked calmer, but also determined. Look, there's something I need to tell you, Kaken began. He took a deep breath, but he never got to say whatever it was that he wanted to say to Izuku. Izuku went rigid, his focus on the forest around them and not at all on Kaken anymore. His whole body was alert. Something was off. Izuku's nose twitched, his ears caught a sound he wasn't familiar with. He could smell something burning. Fire. Izuku was frozen in place. What? Kaken barked the question, obviously annoyed at being interrupted. But then he seemed to sense it too. We should go back, Izuku said, though the smell of burning brush and trees seemed to be coming from the direction of camp. The fire was probably separating them from the camp at this point. Before Kaken could respond, they both heard the sound of trees crashing. Izuku's brow furrowed, not understanding exactly what they were hearing until they saw him. A villain. In a straitjacket. With metal teeth. Izuku gaped. Kaken roughly grabbed Izuku by the wrist and pulled him after him. Izuku jerked back on reflex and they tumbled backwards. What are you doing? Kaken hissed, eyes blazing. More trees crashed, cut down by the long metal teeth as the villain moaned. Izuku scrambled to his feet, and Kaken made a tch noise before they both started running. Of course Kaken had to throw an explosion at one of the metal teeth, just to see. It did nothing. Obviously. It was metal. Ahead. Izuku sniffed the air and felt a measure of calm as he recognized the smells. It was ᴘᴇᴟ and Todoroki. They'd been paired for the test of courage too. Kaken had an explosion sparking in his palm as they came through the bushes, but extinguished it when he saw it was their classmates. Then all four of them were running. "This isn't the direction towards camp," ᴘᴇᴟ yelled as they ran. "He's hurting us." Todoroki grunted in response. Izuku grit his teeth and skidded to a stop. "I can try to distract him, you guys." The moment he stopped, so did his classmates. And then there was a wave of ice forming a barrier between Izuku and the metal-toothed villain. For a moment, Izuku thought it would hold. Then the ice cracked and shattered, sending splinters of ice everywhere. "Move!" The hiss of a whisper was plenty of warning, but Izuku still wasn't used to doing what the Jackal wanted. He wasn't used to it having their best interest at heart. Izuku hesitated. Metal sliced into his shoulder. Blood splattered. The metal tooth grew longer, throwing and then pinning Izuku to the ground as he cried out in pain. Sharp, hot pain burst in his shoulder before it was dulled by the Jackal, and one for all, just enough for Izuku to try to think straight. Izuku looked back at his classmates to make sure they were okay and hadn't been hit like he had. ᴘᴇᴟ had been right behind Izuku. Izuku's breathing stuttered when he saw the blood dripping down ᴘᴇᴟ's face. For a moment, Izuku feared the worst, but then he saw ᴘᴇᴟ didn't have any discernible injuries. The blood, it was Izuku's blood. Midoriya. ᴘᴇᴟ looked pale, his eyes wide, unseeing, like something in him had snapped. Izuku didn't get a chance to ask if he was okay because Dark Shadow let out a high-pitched screech of fear and anger, and then exploded out of ᴘᴇᴟ. Todoroki and Kaken dove to the side, Todoroki throwing up a shield of ice that just barely protected them. Dark Shadow broke the metal tooth holding Izuku to the ground, and Izuku ripped it out of his shoulder before shoving himself back and away as Dark Shadow lifted ᴘᴇᴟ into the air, completely enveloping him. ᴘᴇᴟ cried out, a weak protest of pain as he was overcome by his quirk. Izuku couldn't just stand by seeing his classmate, his friend, hurting like that. His mind raced as he tried to figure out what he could do to help. "Todoroki, use your fire!" Izuku called, turning desperately to face him and Kaken before making to run after ᴘᴇᴟ, who was dragged along by Dark Shadow towards the villain. "Wait!" Kaken grabbed Izuku by the upper arm, pulling him back. Izuku couldn't help flinching and wrenching himself away, putting a good several feet between them. Kaken blinked at him in surprise. Todoroki's eyes narrowed and his expression was indecipherable. "We need to." Izuku didn't get to finish his sentence though. He knew why Kaken didn't want to stop him, he did. ᴘᴇᴟ was demolishing the villain. But using Dark Shadow like that, using ᴘᴇᴟ like that, it reminded Izuku too much of the USJ. It reminded Izuku of his own quirk, and how he had used it that way. Treating it as an out-of-control animal to take down a villain, and then locking it away again. The Jackal wasn't like that. Dark Shadow shouldn't be treated that way either. But Izuku didn't have a way to stop it, not without Kaken or Todoroki. The villain fell unconscious to the ground. ᴘᴇᴟ wasn't done though, or rather, Dark Shadow wasn't. But Kaken looked to Todoroki, and with a silent agreement they both activated their quirks, Kaken his explosions and Todoroki his fire. Dark Shadow screamed and the sound made Izuku cringe. But the quirk retreated inside ᴘᴇᴟ, who gasped and coughed, his whole body shaking. Izuku went to him immediately. "Are you okay?" Izuku asked softly. ᴘᴇᴟ nodded, it was all he seemed to be able to do. "Can you walk?" I think so." ᴘᴇᴟ ground out, and Izuku helped him to his feet. Izuku shot a glare towards Kaken. They should have helped ᴘᴇᴟ rather than letting Dark Shadow consume him like that. "Midoriya, are you alright?" I saw blood." "Don't worry about me, I'm fine," Izuku assured him. "Come on, we need to get back to camp," Izuku said, sharper than he'd intended. Izuku could still smell the fire. They couldn't take the same route they'd taken, but maybe they could head straight through the forest and get back to camp faster. Todoroki led the way, followed by Kaken and then ᴘᴇᴟ. Izuku took the back, focusing on his hearing and sense of smell. Behind The Jackal hissed a warning, and Izuku pivoted and lashed out, slapping away the villain's outstretched hand. The villain wore a mask, a top hat, and a long trench coat. Whatever his quirk was, Izuku knew it involved using his hands. Izuku sensed the villain's surprise and he leapt back just as Izuku aimed to slash at his masked face, his right hand turning into a claw sparking with one for all mid-swing. A snarl ripped from Izuku's throat as he faced the new villain. Behind him he heard his classmates stop too. Izuku held out his left arm, silently ordering them to stay back. He heard Kaken's palms sparking. Izuku knew that sound well. "That's not very nice," the villain said coolly. He sounded far more relaxed than he should in Izuku's opinion. "Especially when all we want to do is talk." "Yeah, right," Kaken snapped, and then lunged. Izuku didn't have time to stop Kaken, or do anything really. As he lashed out, the villain sidestepped, raised his hand, and Kaken vanished. No, that wasn't right. He'd been compressed into a small blue marble. Izuku felt his hackles rise and he bared his teeth. Todoroki sent a lance of ice towards the villain, but he was nimbler than he looked. Izuku called on the Jackal, not caring that his shirt was torn to shreds and his shoes mangled. He took off after the villain, who hadn't really seemed to be running away so much as dodging. Izuku realized his mistake, but it wasn't something he could change, nor was it something he would if he could. The villain realized he could lead Izuku and his classmates wherever he wanted because they would chase him to the ends of the earth to try to get Kaken back. "Leave him," the Jackal growled. "Not worth it." Izuku ignored its words as he continued to race after the villain. It didn't matter if Kaken deserved Izuku's loyalty. The fact of the matter was that, even if they weren't friends, Kaken was still his classmate. Todoroki used his eyes to follow, keeping Tokoemi with him. Izuku felt a pang of shame. He hadn't thought to stay with his friends in his haste to follow after Kaken. The villain was quick, but Izuku caught up with him at the top of a hill. Izuku tackled him and the villain fell forward. The marble rolled just out of the villain's reach. Flinging the villain over and onto his back, Izuku placed a clawed hand around his throat, tight enough to show he meant business but loose enough that he could still breathe. "Let him go," Izuku hissed. The villain made a gesture with his hand and Kaken reappeared. Kaken's eyes were wide, almost scared, but he got himself under control quickly. But they weren't alone on the hill. "Compress, what the hell?" Izuku looked up sharply and saw a tall black-haired man covered in burns. His hands were in his pockets, and he too looked far too relaxed and in control. Izuku growled, and shoved off of the villain, Compress, and backed away, keeping clear of the villain's hands. Compress coughed and scrambled up onto his feet before backing up to be closer to the black-haired guy. He rubbed gingerly at his throat. The Jackal scoffed. He hadn't squeezed that hard. "He's the one Shigaraki wants." Compress nodded towards Izuku. Izuku swallowed. "Shigaraki wanted him? Why?" "You ain't taking Deku!" Kaken snarled. Izuku blinked. He hadn't expected Kaken to care as much as he did. But then, it probably had less to do with it being who he was so much as Kaken would try to save him in spite of being who he was. A portal opened behind Compress and the other villain. Izuku immediately recognized the portal type from the USJ. He couldn't help the cold feeling that washed over him as he wondered whether there would be another ᴛᴏ that came out or Shigaraki himself. "Magna!" the black-haired villain called, sounding bored, but his mouth opened in a toothy grin. "Right." The voice came from behind Izuku. But he didn't get a chance to turn and see who it was or where it was from. A weird feeling came over Izuku then. He couldn't put his finger on it, but it felt like something had changed. Kaken's red eyes were wide and there was a look of horror on his face. His hand was outstretched towards Izuku. That was the last thing Izuku saw before something slammed into the back of his head and he was thrown into darkness. "Wake up," Izuku groaned. His head hurt. It felt like he'd banged it really hard against something. "You did." The harsh snap of the Jackal's voice brought Izuku closer to consciousness. His whole body ached. "Where was he?" "Captured," the Jackal provided unhelpfully. Izuku almost rolled his eyes, but found his head was pounding. He might have a concussion. No, he almost certainly had one. Izuku was finding it hard to think straight. His shoulder hurt too, and he vaguely remembered it being stabbed by a metal tooth. The thought seemed silly, but he was pretty sure that was what had happened. Blinking, the room came into view. It was dimly lit, but it appeared to be a bar of some kind. The villains were there. Izuku tried to move only to find he was chained to a metal chair. And there was something over his face, no, his mouth. A muzzle. Izuku's eyes were wide now as he remembered what had happened. The training camp. The attack. That villain with the compress quirk. Izuku had been trapped, unable to do anything. Worse than the dark by far. He was there, compress. He had a bandage over his wrist. Probably a bite mark. Izuku didn't remember that. Not that he was mad at the jackal for trying to escape. "You're awake," Shigaraki commented. His voice sounded coarse. "Good." Izuku didn't answer. What could he say? He didn't want to be there. He also had no idea what they wanted from him. "Dabi, take off the muzzle," Shigaraki ordered, waving towards the tall black-haired man with burns. Dabi eyed Izuku, his gaze briefly flicking over to Compress's injury. "Twice, take off the muzzle." "What?" Twice balked, but ended up coming over and carefully undoing the muzzle. "He's close enough." The jackal pushed just enough for Izuku to know it wanted to snap at the villain, maybe catch a finger or two. Izuku shook his head. And then Shigaraki started talking about justice, about the Heroes' Society. Izuku was very confused as to where Shigaraki was going until finally, he got to the point. "Everyone here has been wronged by heroes in one respect or another, and so have you." Shigaraki grinned, and it clicked in Izuku's mind what Shigaraki was getting at. "You're trying to recruit me?" Izuku asked, blinking. But Shigaraki just laughed. It was a cold, grating sound. "No, not you." He grinned wickedly. "The monster inside you." Izuku's blood ran cold, and he felt a bead of sweat trickle down the back of his neck. Of course. They wanted the jackal. A deep thundering kukuku echoed through Izuku's mind, making him shiver. "It has been trapped inside you, forced to stay hidden and come at your every beck and call. But I see its potential. It doesn't need a master. It needs a partner." Shiragaki's words were like ice. "Now don't be shy," Shigaraki said, voice filled with amusement. "I want to see it again." His eyes flashed. The jackal. Izuku was frozen, eye wide and body rigid. "Let me talk with him," the jackal suggested. "Just to talk." Izuku shook his head violently, not trusting his voice. There was no way he was letting it out to talk with Shigaraki. Izuku knew the jackal could force him into the dark after he handed over control, and even if he and the jackal seemed to be seeing eye to eye currently, he didn't have enough faith that the jackal would turn down Shigaraki's offer, whatever it may be. "Forget it," Izuku ground out. "I'm not letting it out. I saw it during the sports festival," Shigaraki continued as though Izuku hadn't spoken. "The bloodlust, the desire to tear its enemy apart. It's something we have in common, the jackal and I." His voice was brittle, but filled with some kind of mania Izuku couldn't name. "And you who play at being a hero, you trapped the jackal. It longs to be free. To kill. Just like me." "You're wrong," Izuku snapped, trying to change his cold fear into some kind of anger, something to keep him going. "And even if you were right, I won't ever let it do something like that." Shigaraki laughed, a broken, jarring cackle that sent a shiver down Izuku's spine. Then he looked at Izuku like he was a fool or a silly child who knew nothing of the world. Shigaraki leaned a little closer and gave a wide grin. "It ripped out my Numu's brain, feasted on its flesh," Shigaraki hissed, his eyes bright. "I don't think you could possibly contain it." Izuku's blood felt frozen in place. He repeated Shigaraki's words in his mind. Ripped its brain out. Feasted on its flesh. There were flashes of memory. His own memory of waking up to a bloody mess. The severed arm. Then flashes of what could only be the jackal's memory. blood, the stench of death, the taste of flesh hot on his tongue. The jackal had. He gagged and tasted bile. Thankfully, the muzzle had been removed. Lurching forward as much as he could with his restraints, Izuku emptied his stomach onto the floor. The phantom smell of blood thickened the air, and the whole bar seemed to be overlaid by an image of the USJ, of the ᴛᴏ with its brains splattered across the floor. Izuku coughed, wretched. Tears gathered in his eyes from how violently he'd reacted. Toshinori and Aizawa-sensei were right. He didn't want to know what happened at the USJ. Not really. Not at all. I'll keep those memories, the jackal whispered. The room looked normal again, the phantom smell gone. Izuku breathed a little easier. Shigaraki made a disgusted sound. Kurogyuri warped the mess away. Izuku coughed again. Why did the jackal do that, though? Let him see that. Was it trying to throw Izuku in the dark? Take control? The jackal growled deep and low, like it was offended, but said nothing. I have no desire to hurt you, Shigaraki told him flatly, but Izuku could hear the growing irritation in his voice. But I will if it's the only way to get the jackal out. Why? Izuku asked. The question came out like a croak. But Izuku did want to know the answer, and anything that put off Shigaraki hurting him was a good thing. It killed your ᴅᴜᴛᴏ, so why? Because it bested my ᴛᴏ and is therefore better than my ᴛᴏ, Shigaraki said with a grin, eyes bright. And I want it. And Izuku understood. Sort of. Shigaraki saw the ᴛᴏ as a toy, a pawn, and the jackal had taken it out. Instead of hating the jackal like Izuku would have expected, Shigaraki had grown interested in it. He wanted it as his own. The jackal was just another toy to him. Izuku could only imagine he saw the jackal that way as opposed to being a threat because it was a quirk. Theoretically it could be taken and used just like any other quirk. I will not be used, the jackal hissed. Anyone who lays hands on us will regret it. Izuku swallowed. He hoped Shigaraki would just let him be. Try to wear him down maybe. Because he wasn't sure he'd be able to stop the jackal or if he wanted to. Right then, Izuku was pretty willing to use any power he had to escape. Except he was afraid of what would happen. They'd made a deal, he and the jackal. But how far would it extend? Especially when Shigaraki was offering freedom. Izuku didn't know the answer, and that scared him. Toshi was pretty great at ignoring things. Specifically pretending things that had happened hadn't. Like seeing Izuku, Midoriya, half naked. Toshi had been able to face Midoriya no problem the following Monday. Really. And if he had flashes of the memory late at night when he was alone missing Izuku's warmth, well, that wasn't too big of a deal, right? He'd had to take several more cold showers in the days that followed Midoriya's sleepover. But that was a small price to pay. And one Toshi would gladly pay in exchange for his sanity, which he felt he was on the verge of losing at any time. When Midoriya had left for the training camp, Toshi thought he could use that time to really get over those memories and visions that included Midoriya. He decided he just needed to find something else to replace those images. He felt a little weird actively trying to find someone else to imagine, but he knew he shouldn't be imagining Midoriya. But before he'd even gotten the chance to do some searching on the internet, he'd gotten a text from Midoriya. At first he told himself he shouldn't answer. But what if something had happened? The next thing he knew, he was calling the boy. I miss you. The words had stopped his heart. Or at least it had felt that way. And then his own admission had come tumbling out without his say-so. Of course Toshi couldn't say no when Midoriya asked if he could call again, even though Toshi knew he should have told the boy to spend time with his friends or call his mother, and not waste time on an old man like Toshi. But he didn't say any of that. So every night Toshi got in the habit of waiting for Midoriya to call. It became the best part of his evenings. And no, he wasn't going to think too deeply about what that meant. When one night Midoriya didn't call, Toshi had felt on edge. He warred with himself over whether he should call Midoriya himself. Just as he was about to, though, he stopped himself. Because, what was he even doing? Midoriya was at a training camp with his class. Having fun with his friends. Midoriya didn't need Toshi bothering him. Maybe Midoriya had just been a little lonely those first few nights, but now he obviously didn't need Toshi anymore. The thought should have put Toshi at ease, knowing Midoriya was probably doing just fine without him, but instead it ate at him like some kind of sickness. Maybe that's what this was. A sickness. Toshi didn't have long to wallow or examine his feelings though, because only an hour or so later his phone was exploding with texts from Yue. There'd been an attack on the training camp. Izuku Midoriya had been taken. Toshi felt like his whole body had been frozen in place. He felt the blood drain from his face, and his heart clenched painfully. He swallowed thickly as he tried to tell himself that if they'd taken Izuku, that meant they wanted him alive. He wasn't dead. Probably. All Might was called to be on the task force, and there was no way Toshi was going to not go. Toshi would do everything in his power to save Izuku. He met up with the other pro-heroes and his colleagues at the police station. The plan was a good one. They'd be able to take the League of Villains by surprise and rescue Midoriya. Just hearing how everything would go down, and knowing how many heroes would be there, set Toshi's mind a little at ease. Aizawa caught him at the end of the meeting though, nodded his head towards the end of an empty hall. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Aizawa asked quietly, giving Toshi a meaningful look. Toshi didn't need to think about it though. It didn't matter whether it was a good or bad idea. "Not really. I have to do this," Toshi answered just as quietly. "You're not exactly objective when it comes to Midoriya," Aizawa reminded him, a frown pulling at his lips. "Are you going to be able to keep it together if you get there and find out they've been torturing him or something?" Toshi's jaw set and he clenched his fists. The very idea was enough to make Toshi feel sick. Worse, Aizawa's words sent Toshi's mind to conjuring images of finding Midoriya broken and bloody. Toshi tasted bile but swallowed it back. He understood Aizawa's point. He really did. But it didn't change anything. "I'm a profession, I can handle it," Toshi told him. "Your hands are clenched," Aizawa commented dryly. "And your jaw is tense. Just thinking about it has you on edge. What are you going to do if you actually—" "Stop it!" Toshi hissed and Aizawa broke off. Toshi shifted, knowing full well he'd proven Aizawa's point. "I'm going." It was final. "You're a real idiot, you know that?" Aizawa sighed and shook his head. Toshi didn't have anything to say to that. "I'd be there if I could," Aizawa murmured. "But I've got a press conference to deal with. Villains to mislead." He fixed Toshi with a firm look. "Go get Midoriya. Bring my student back safe." "I will," Toshi vowed. Izuku didn't know how long he'd been there. And the villains were not exactly forthcoming when he asked questions. The girl, who had introduced herself as Himiko Toga, kept looking at him too. It was freaky. The jackal growled any time she came too near, and Izuku let the sound out in the hopes that it would make her back off. It didn't. If anything, it made her eyes sparkle. Other than that, the villains left him alone ever since Shigaraki went somewhere. Presumably to see his sensei, who Izuku thought was likely this all-for-one Tashinori had told him about. They hadn't put the muzzle back on, which Izuku was thankful for, but the chains were tight and heavy. Izuku thought maybe he might be able to transform and use one for all to break his bindings, but not before he was attacked by one of the other villains there or compressed by compress. All he could really do was wait. Izuku wanted to believe everything would be alright. That Tashinori would save them. But he had his reservations. How would Tashinori even be able to find them? The thoughts and worries spun around and around in his mind until he didn't want to even think anymore. But his brain wouldn't listen, not until the jackal spoke. "Our mate will come for us." The jackal's voice whispered through his mind, cutting off the circular worries and concerns Izuku was once again thinking through. Izuku blinked. Mate. Right. He felt his face flush at the mere thought. He pressed back against it, reminding the jackal, and himself, that Tashinori was his mentor, his teacher, his friend maybe, but not his mate. Kukuku. That rumbling laughter again. But there was a thread of annoyance in it. "You love him?" it accused sweetly. Izuku swallowed. Well, yes. Of course he did. Izuku had come to terms that he loved Tashinori. He loved his mom too. And his close friends. So of course he loved Tashinori. Tashinori was his precious mentor, his teacher, his friend. They were connected by something stronger than blood. Lies. The jackal snarled harshly. Coward. Izuku flinched and felt a rush of shame. Shame because the jackal was right. It was something Izuku hadn't let himself think about. His feelings towards Tashinori. Ever since his mother had asked him about how he felt, Izuku had been avoiding thinking about it too deeply. He liked Tashinori. He liked him a lot. The jackal scoffed. Okay, fine, Izuku loved Tashinori. Probably. Maybe. Izuku wasn't even sure he knew what love was in the first place. He'd never felt it before. Unless this was it. It wasn't something Izuku was sure he could ever admit to, though. These feelings he had towards Tashinori. His mentor. His friend. He is our mate. Yours and mine. The jackal whispered, sounding almost reassuring. I love him too. Izuku felt his heart speed up, followed by an illogical rush of jealousy. More than anything, though, Izuku felt the truth of those words. The jackal did love Tashinori. A portal opened at one end of the room and Shigaraki and Kurogiri stepped through. Dabi, Toga, Compress twice, and the other villains all looked up from what they were doing. Shigaraki sat at the bar and flipped on the television. Izuku startled when he saw Principal Nezu and Aizawa-sensei. They were at a press conference. They were apologizing. They had no idea where he was. Izuku's heart sank. Then the questions started. Are you certain he didn't go with the villains willingly? One reporter asked. We saw at the sports festival how he attacked his fellow students so violently. He's practically an animal. Shigaraki smirked and glanced towards Izuku. The turmoil Izuku felt was tying his stomach in knots. They were right, but they were also wrong. He wanted to tell them he wasn't a villain, his quirk wasn't one either, probably. The jackal growled at the thought. Shigaraki shut off the TV before Aizawa-sensei responded. He turned to Izuku looking smug. You see? Shigaraki murmured. No one wants the jackal, no one but me. Everyone's afraid of it. Not me. He smiled darkly. Fight for your freedom, Jackal, and I'll never make you return to your weaker form. Izuku felt the jackal push. Panicking, Izuku shoved back, squeezing his eyes hurt and gritting his teeth. But the jackal didn't push hard, it was more like a knock than a push really. Let me do this, the jackal said. Shigaraki wants to see me. So let him. Izuku still hesitated. Even if you don't trust me, trust that I love our mate. Torn as he was, Izuku felt like maybe he could trust that. It was one of the few things they had in common. How they felt for Tashinori. There wasn't much choice Izuku had anyway, since the heroes didn't know where he was. He was on his own. Well, not alone. He had the jackal. Okay, Izuku decided. And then Izuku let go. His body changed, morphed, grew larger and stronger as he became the jackal. The chains were tight and unbearably sharp as they dug into his thickly furred hide. Izuku didn't go into the dark exactly, but he let the jackal take the reins. Part of him was waiting for the jackal to try to lock him away. But it didn't. It did play its part well, though. If it was playing. Kukukuku. The jackal let out its low dark laughter. Golden eyes flashed as it eyed the villains in the room. Free it, Shigaraki ordered, nodding towards Dabi. The man shot Shigaraki an annoyed look and barked at Twice to do it. Twice grumbled but carefully approached and started undoing Izuku's bindings. Free! The jackal chuckled when the chains fell from its form. Falling forward out of the chair and into a crouch, the jackal considered the villains. It flexed its muscles. Claws dug into the wood of the floor. Its eyes fell on Shigaraki. It didn't get a chance to pounce. Pizza delivery! The voice rang out from the front door, startling everyone. They all froze, confused and uncertain. And then the wall exploded in a shower of stone and debris. Tashinori. All Might. He was there. Izuku couldn't help it, he fought for control. The jackal led him, sensing his desperation, his form withdrawing until only Izuku remained. Izuku smiled and relished the way Toshinori whispered his name upon seeing him. Their reunion was short-lived. Izuku opened his mouth to reply but couldn't. Suddenly Izuku was choking. He coughed and spat, but some kind of black ooze was consuming him, pulling him in. Izuku saw Toshinori lunge for him, trying to grab him, but he was too late. Then everything was black before Izuku found himself on the ground of a half-destroyed warehouse. Coughing, Izuku looked around. His heart almost stopped. Pro-heroes. All around were pro-heroes laying on the ground, they looked dead. Alive, the jackal noted, it could tell, but not conscious. And there, in the air, several feet above the ground floated ⴅ-ᴜ. It could only be him. The fierce pressure his very presence gave off was enough to make Izuku's knees feel like buckling, though he kept himself from falling through sheer willpower. ⴅ-ᴜ spoke so casually, like his whole hideout wasn't under attack by a veritable army of pro-heroes. But then, he had taken out all the heroes with seeming ease. Izuku felt a cold sweat prickle at the back of his neck. "Let me out," the jackal whispered, almost sounding urgent, as though it too recognized the inherent danger ⴅ-ᴜ presented. Izuku didn't think that would be a good idea, though. He didn't need ⴅ-ᴜ thinking he was a threat. Maybe he'd just leave him alone and… Izuku's nose twitched. He wasn't in jackal form, but his sense of smell was still heightened, and there… No, it couldn't be. He smelled Kaken. Ida. Yaoyorozu. Kirishima. Todoroki. No, that couldn't be right. Impossible. Izuku shook his head. It didn't matter anyway. Aside from ⴅ-ᴜ, the rest of the League of Villains had been transported there along with Izuku. Swallowing, Izuku tried to back up, but found he was boxed in. And then Toshinori was there, slamming into ⴅ-ᴜ, who took the punch like it was nothing. The blood drained from Izuku's face at seeing that. Worse was knowing that Toshinori didn't have his full power because he'd given it to Izuku. "It took you 30 seconds to get here," ⴅ-ᴜ mused. "You've lost your touch, All Might." Toshinori growled, but didn't answer him. Instead his gaze found Izuku. Those blue eyes asked him if he was alright, and all Izuku could do was manage a small nod. Toshinori didn't need to be worrying about him, not when he needed to focus on fighting, on winning. Even so, Izuku saw how Toshinori's eyes darted to his injured shoulder. Toshinori's jaw tightened. Toshinori traded blows with ⴅ-ᴜ. They almost seemed evenly matched. Every time they clashed, Izuku could feel the amount of power rolling off both of them in waves. It was then that Izuku realized Toshinori was holding himself back. He wasn't using his full power. It only took a moment to understand why. He didn't want to hurt Izuku. Izuku was in the way. The knowledge cut him, but it also spurred his mind to race, to find a solution. He couldn't run though, he was surrounded by villains. It was times like these he wished he could fly. He didn't think jumping would be good enough. Deku! Izuku's gaze snapped up just as Ida and Kaken rocketed into the air off of a ramp of ice that had appeared out of nowhere. Izuku's first thought was wondering why Kaken was even there in the first place. Why had he gone to try to save him of all people? His second thought was realizing what Kaken wanted from him. Kaken's hand was outstretched. Just like it had been at the training camp. An offer. A rescue. His heartbeat echoed in his ears and time seemed to slow. It was a way out. All he had to do was channel one for all, jump, and take Kaken's hand. But that hand had burned him, hurt him. Izuku wasn't sure he could do it. But staying would just burden Toshinori. "Izuku, go!" Toshinori yelled. And that was what did it. What made Izuku decide he had to take Kaken's hand. He'd do anything for Toshinori. His legs transformed and he channeled one for all, shoving off the ground, leaving a crater in his wake. Izuku reached out and took Kaken's hand. He flinched when they made contact, but he did it. Izuku felt his heart clench painfully as he realized he was leaving Toshinori behind. Izuku felt a moment of panic as he saw the villains try to follow. But Mount Lady stopped them. They were home free. Izuku didn't know what else to do but follow Kaken and Ida into the crowded square. They met up with his other classmates. Kirishima offered Izuku his jacket, and Izuku pulled it on numbly. It wouldn't do to walk around with a shoulder wound and shirtless in a crowd. Izuku still didn't have shoes, but the jacket was good enough for now. "Are you all right, Midoriya?" Ida asked carefully, but Izuku couldn't pay attention to what was being said because there was a large TV on one of the buildings. It was showing the news. It was showing the fight between Toshinori and All for One. Toshinori. Izuku couldn't take his eyes off him. He was fighting All for One. And his form changed. One moment he was All Might, and then one hard explosion of a punch by All for One, and it was just Toshinori. Izuku felt his heart stop. His lips parted and his breath stuttered. Blood. Toshinori was bleeding. He was hurt. No! The word was so loud and strong that Izuku staggered. It was just an urgent tug at first, a push the Jackal expected him to follow. But Izuku didn't. As much as he wanted to, Izuku didn't run to Toshinori's aid. Instead, he just stood there staring up at the screen. "We must go to him." The Jackal clawed at Izuku, but he kept it down, contained. Toshinori had told him to go, to run. "He's in danger. In pain." Izuku flinched from the strength of the screams. "We must protect our mate." His right hand curled into a claw and Izuku grasped the wrist with his left hand, holding the Jackal at bay. At the same time he watched on the huge screen as All for One attacked Toshinori. He felt Kaken's eyes on him, on his trembling claw, but Izuku was barely keeping it together as he held the Jackal back. All Izuku could do was watch. Watch as Toshinori took on All for One. Izuku wasn't sure he breathed at all until All for One fell and Toshinori raised his fist in victory. Izuku sobbed. Seeing Toshinori like that was painful. And then Toshinori pointing and telling him he was next. It was too much. Tears streamed down his face, his expression contorted into some mix between relief and anguish. He wiped his eyes with his forearm, trying to get himself under control. He sniffled, but was able to stop the tears. That was when he noticed Kaken was staring at him. His red eyes flicked from the thin, emaciated form of Toshinori on the screen then back to Izuku. A cold feeling ran down Izuku's spine. This wasn't the first time Kaken had seen All Might's true form. He just hadn't known it at the time. Kaken's hand closed around Izuku's wrist and then he was tugging him, yanking him after him. Izuku didn't have the energy to try to stop him, and he batted away the Jackal's offers to do it for him. Kirishima noticed them leaving and called out to Kaken, who just grunted something in response. Izuku was dragged away from the crowd into an alleyway. It was nostalgic almost, the way Kaken tossed him towards one of the walls and fixed him with a determined gaze. But his expression wasn't haughty or smug like normal. Instead he looked confused. "All along, that weird old guy, it was All Might," Kaken murmured, his expression still disbelieving. His gaze met Izuku's. "From the very beginning, All Might was training you." "Yeah," Izuku nodded. There wasn't any way around admitting that. "I told you nothing bad was going on." Kaken didn't seem to be listening though. He seemed to be processing something. Something that didn't make sense to him. "Your Quirk, the Jackal, it called All Might its mate at the USJ," Kaken said slowly. Izuku swallowed and felt a cold sweat start at the back of his neck. So Todoroki had heard it, and so had Kaken. How many people in his class thought something weird was going on between them? Was that why ɪɪṛᴜ gave Izuku that weird smile every time he went to have lunch with Toshinori? Oh geez. Izuku felt his face heating up and he grimaced. Everyone had it all wrong. It's not what you think," Izuku tried. His voice sounded weak even to his own ears. But Kaken seemed to bypass any logical conclusions and instead landed on his default where Izuku was concerned. "Show it to me." Kaken growled, eyes hard and filled with challenge. "What?" Izuku stammered, blinking. "Show me the fucking Quirk that All Might thought was worthy of his training." Kaken snapped his palms, sparking. He was angry to be sure, but there was something desperate in his words too. "Now isn't the time for this!" Izuku cried. "Toshi, All Might is hurt, he won, but he's hurt and I need to make sure he's—" Izuku trailed off. There was no way he'd be able to talk to Toshinori now. He knew that. Toshinori would be taken to the hospital. The police would want to talk with him. Izuku wasn't important enough to be there with him. They were, at most, just friends after all. "When?" Kaken demanded. Izuku blinked. Kaken rolled his eyes. "When is the time for this?" "Do it," the Jackal growled. "Fight him." "You want to fight that bad?" Izuku asked, hardly believing that Kaken was really pushing for this. It seemed insane. He wasn't surprised the Jackal wanted to, but that was part of the issue anyway. "I want to see your fucking Quirk," Kaken said, his voice level. Kaken was really serious about this. Izuku shook his head and let out a breath. "I guess," Izuku sighed as he thought. "I guess when we get back to UA. It'd be better to do it on campus, right? Closer to Recovery Girl if something went wrong." Although now that he'd actually pseudo-agreed, Izuku was regretting it. The Jackal hated Kaken with a passion, but Izuku didn't want him dead or maimed. The Jackal's dark rumbling laughter echoed through his head. Izuku reminded it of their deal. No killing. No serious injuries. The Jackal snorted. "Okay." Kaken smirked. "It's a deal." After that, Izuku had to go with the police. They took him to the hospital first for his injuries. Then he gave his statement, and as much detail about the villains and what they'd said as possible. Izuku had asked about Toshinori, but no one would tell him anything. His mother came to pick him up. She was a wreck, crying and hugging him tightly. He assured her he was okay, but she didn't seem to believe him. She didn't want him to go back to UA. Izuku didn't know what to say to that other than it was his dream. Izuku checked his phone periodically, half expecting to get a text message from Toshinori. He fell asleep on his bed, his phone propped up in his hand. The phone buzzed in his hand, pulling him from a dream he couldn't remember. Izuku blinked dazedly until he realized what had woken him up. Toshinori had messaged him. Izuku was out the door in a matter of seconds, hardly pausing to pull his shoes on. He rushed to the beach, jogging the entire way. He knew logically that since Toshinori had texted him, he must be okay. He wasn't in the hospital, so he had to be okay. But Izuku couldn't help the cold fear he felt. It wasn't until he saw Toshinori standing there on the beach, one arm in a sling and the other covered in bandages, but very much alive, that Izuku finally felt some semblance of peace. This time Izuku couldn't keep himself from throwing his arms around Toshinori. Izuku was careful, oh so careful, so as not to hurt or aggravate his injuries, but he still held him tightly. He felt Toshinori's good arm tighten around him as well. "You're okay," Izuku whispered, trying to keep from crying. "I'm alive," Toshinori murmured into his hair. "So are you." Izuku let out a sob. "It's okay. I thought I saw you change you ran out of time, and I thought—" Izuku's words were probably too broken for Toshinori to even understand. Toshinori hushed him, rubbing his back gently and murmuring softly. "All Might is gone," he admitted, voice quiet, somber. "I'm retired. But I'm alive. Everyone is. I'm glad. I'm so glad. So glad you're safe." Izuku sobbed, burying his head in Toshinori's chest. Toshinori rubbed his back before his hand migrated up into his hair, careful of the bandages around his head. And then Toshinori was pulling him tighter against him. They stayed like that for a long while, just holding one another. "Are you all right?" Toshinori asked him after Izuku's tears had subsided. I'm fine," Izuku assured him, brow creasing because Toshinori really should be worrying about himself, not Izuku. And you?" "Nothing major," Toshinori said with a small smile. "Your arm is in a sling," Izuku pointed out dryly. Toshinori gave a small shrug. You're staying at UA though, right? As a teacher?" Toshinori blinked. Principal Nedza told me I could stay and I have to finish training you, don't I? Toshinori ruffled Izuku's hair fondly. Izuku grinned up at him. Good. At least they'd still see each other. Nothing had changed too much. He'd still be teaching Class 1A. Izuku remembered then what he and Kaken had mentioned, what Todoroki had mentioned. He chewed his lip a moment, trying to decide whether now was a good time to bring this up. But he didn't know when Toshinori might hear about it. So it was best to get it out of the way. He didn't want Toshinori to hear it from someone else and freak, or something. I need to tell you something, Izuku told Toshinori quietly. What's on your mind? He prodded gently when Izuku fell silent. The Jackal. It calls you our mate. Izuku managed to get the words out even if they got stuck in his throat on the way out. He couldn't bear to look at Toshinori's expression. Izuku was sure he'd be horrified. But he had a right to know, especially with how often he dealt with Jackal. Besides, Kaken and Todoroki already knew and probably half if not all of Class 1A. He felt Toshinori's hand rest lightly on his head in a gesture of comfort. I know. Izuku's head jerked up, eyes wide as he searched Toshinori's thin face. He wasn't lying. He knew. For how long had he known, Izuku wondered. Toshinori just smiled kindly down at him, smoothing his mess of green hair. More than anything, it was that kind, almost loving expression on Toshinori's face that gave Izuku the confidence to say what he said next. I think I love you. Toshinori's hand stilled on his head. Sorry, no, that came out wrong, Izuku stammered. He took a deep breath and met Toshinori's eyes. I do love you. Toshinori, for the first time really since Izuku got to know him, looked like he didn't know what to do or say. He did pull his hand back though and moved a little further back from Izuku. Toshinori didn't meet his gaze. The pain Izuku felt from the sudden withdrawal made him flinch. Midoriya, Toshinori began, voice quiet. What you're feeling, it's not what you think. What? Izuku's brow furrowed, confused. That wasn't what he'd expected. From what I can tell, Toshinori continued, his voice so gentle, I was one of the first persons to show you any kind of care outside your family. Izuku supposed that wasn't untrue. Prior to Toshinori, Izuku hadn't really had any friends. All he really had was his mother. I gave you positive attention and comfort, and I think that made you happy. Toshinori let out a breath. You're displacing those feelings, or confusing them, that gratitude, that happiness for love. No. Izuku shook his head. A cold feeling was spreading through him. I've seen it before, Izuku, Toshinori said, speaking over Izuku's denial. I've experienced it before. Izuku couldn't help the pang of jealousy, and the need to know who Toshinori had felt such feelings for. He pushed back against it though. That's not true, Izuku argued, and he hated how his voice shook, hated how his eyes felt wet. That's not what I'm feeling, it's not just gratitude. Izuku almost spat the word. I have plenty of people in my life now that give me positive attention. And I don't love them the way I. Midoriya. Toshinori said his name sharply enough that Izuku's mouth snapped shut. They were both silent for a long while. It was obvious to Izuku that Toshinori didn't feel the same way. What had he expected though? Why would Toshinori, All Might, be interested in him? What had he been thinking? Why had he done something so stupid as confessing? Why had he told him? I really screwed everything up, Izuku murmured. But Toshinori shook his head. No, Midoriya, The look of dismay on Toshinori's face made Izuku's chest ache. Toshinori reached out as though to touch him, but he pulled his hand back. He seemed to decide something then, and a look of resolve replacing the tired sadness. Toshinori reached out and placed his hand on Izuku's head. Sliding his hand into Izuku's hair, he gave a light tug and Izuku came willingly back into an embrace. Toshinori sighed. I care about you a great deal, Midoriya, Toshinori told him quietly. And I will always be here for you. No matter what. You haven't screwed anything up and you never could. Not with me. Izuku wrapped his hands around Toshinori and clutched the back of his shirt tightly. He breathed deeply, feeling calm and happy in his arms. The Jackal felt it too. The soothing peace that Toshinori seemed to always give them. Izuku was careful to avoid touching or putting pressure on Toshinori's injured arm. There was still that thorn of pain in his heart though, that knowledge that his feelings weren't returned. Izuku tried to ignore it. There wasn't anything he could do about it. Not true. Izuku almost flinched at the sound of the Jackal's growl. You alright? Toshinori asked. Izuku nodded and pressed himself closer. He heard Toshinori let out a little breath of laughter before tightening his hold as well. What did the Jackal mean? Kukuku. The Jackal's harsh laughter was jarring. If he didn't feel the same, he would have said so, would have used it as a reason to reject you. Izuku almost smiled, because the Jackal made a good point. Toshinori hadn't said he didn't love him. He'd even said that he cared about him a great deal, whatever that meant. But one of the best ways to get Izuku to give up would be to tell him he had no chance whatsoever. Toshinori didn't say that though. All he'd said was that Izuku was confused. Show him. The Jackal suggested, sounding just a little sly. The Jackal was right. Izuku found it mildly bizarre that he and the Jackal were actually on the same page on something, but so far he'd found they almost always agreed where Toshinori was concerned. Yes. Izuku would show Toshinori this wasn't simply a confusion of feelings. Not now, not right then. Toshinori needed some time. So did Izuku. But maybe Izuku still had a chance. They'd all moved into the new dorms at UA after the whole Kamino Ward incident. Izuku's mother hadn't been too happy about it, but she'd let Izuku go. It was nice being that close to school and to his friends. And to Toshinori, who had an apartment on campus along with the rest of the faculty. On weekends though, well, everyone went home to visit their family. Izuku was no different. Except the upcoming weekend, his mother was scheduled to work most of it. So really, Izuku would be just hanging out at home alone if he went home. It wasn't that appealing, just hanging out at home all by himself when everyone else was with their family. Even the teachers went to their homes on the weekend. Izuku imagined Toshinori would also. Toshinori. Izuku had decided he was going to show him it wasn't just gratitude, but real feelings that he had for him. Going about that was a lot harder than Izuku had thought. Okay, he hadn't really thought about how he would go about it at all, and that was the problem. The best Izuku could come up with was to try to court him. His face flushed just thinking the phrase. But the upcoming weekend was perfect. Well, if Toshinori let Izuku go home with him anyway. They still had lunch together about once or, if Izuku really pushed, twice a week. So Izuku figured Toshinori wasn't avoiding him or anything. Izuku had noticed that Toshinori didn't touch him as much. No more lingering head pats. But Izuku could tell Toshinori wanted to. He was just holding himself back for Izuku's sake. It was making Izuku crazy. 2 days before the weekend they had lunch together. Toshinori was standoffish as was his new usual. They chatted about class, one for all, and eventually Izuku's waiting paid off. Are you looking forward to the weekend? Toshinori asked. Izuku jumped at the chance, trying not to seem as excited as he did. Because he wasn't excited for the weekend so much as the opportunity to spend more time with Toshinori. Oh, well, I mean I'll be by myself the whole, time, Izuku stammered. He mentally slapped himself. He had practiced exactly what and how he would say the night before, and yet now, actually in front of Toshinori, he couldn't seem to remember what to do or say. Izuku could hear the Jackal laughing at him. He felt so embarrassed, but Toshinori didn't seem to notice. Is your mother working? Toshinori guessed, voice soft, understanding. Izuku nodded. Toshinori opened his mouth to continue but paused. Izuku watched Toshinori, watched that internal struggle. Izuku knew he wanted to invite Izuku over, offer him a place where he wouldn't be lonely, but worried he would be overstepping, feeding into Izuku's so-called misplaced feelings. Could I? Izuku began as he realized he couldn't trust that Toshinori would invite him over, not when Tashinori was actively trying to distance himself. Would it be okay if, this weekend are you? Would you like to come over so you're not alone? Tashinori asked, a soft smile on his lips. Izuku flushed and nodded his head emphatically. Tashinori seemed to remember he wasn't supposed to find Izuku's reaction endearing since he coughed and looked away. It was too late though. The offer was extended and Izuku had accepted. Izuku couldn't help beaming the rest of lunch. Tashinori looked happy too, a little anxious, but happy. It was a common theme with Tashinori that Izuku had noticed. He'd say or do something and then afterwards seem to think he shouldn't have said or done it. Izuku thought it was silly. Nothing Tashinori had done or said to Izuku ever needed to be taken back. Izuku could hardly wait for the week to end. Could hardly wait for the weekend. As the days progressed, Izuku noticed how Tashinori seemed to go from relatively happy to very nervous, and Izuku felt a little bad because he was pretty sure he knew why. When classes ended on Friday, Izuku raced up to the dorms to get his bag, which he'd packed the night before, and headed towards Tashinori's on-campus apartment. He figured they'd meet there and walk together to Tashinori's apartment. Although Tashinori seemed surprised to see him there, and then looked both ways down the hall as though to check for someone watching. It was almost like he thought they were doing something wrong. Izuku didn't understand it at all. The train wasn't too crowded, which Izuku was a little sorry for since he was hoping it would give him an excuse to be closer to Tashinori. Still, standing side by side, using the same handhold with their hands only inches apart was good. Standing like that, their height difference was painfully obvious. Not that Izuku didn't like it, because he did. He liked how tall Tashinori was. Tashinori seemed a little nervous, so Izuku tried to keep his mind off of whatever he was worried about by talking about classes and hero news. It seemed to help a little, and by the time they got to Tashinori's apartment the atmosphere between them was more relaxed. Izuku helped with dinner and the dishes afterwards. It was so domestic it was like a dream. One Izuku never wanted to wake up from. By the time they were done though, it wasn't quite bedtime, and besides, it was a Friday night. What, would you like to do? Tashinori asked nervously. I have some playing cards maybe. He trailed off and scratched at the back of his neck self-consciously. Izuku couldn't help it. He thought it was cute. Tashinori had no idea what to do and was getting flustered. In all his life Izuku could never have imagined that Tashinori could get as flustered as Izuku felt. I brought some movies, Izuku told him brightly, pulling open his backpack and finding the films he'd bought only a week ago. There were just 3. All romances. It was only then, after he laid them out for Tashinori to choose and Tashinori gave him a wary look, that Izuku realized his intentions could be misunderstood. Midoriya, Tashinori began, sounding like he was going to scold him, or something. You like romances? Izuku defended quickly. He really had only gotten them because Tashinori had said he liked the genre, not because he was hoping to start something. Not that he was opposed to something starting, but that wasn't the point. It's not, I didn't mean for... He scrubbed a hand over his face trying to stop the flush he felt branding his face. It's okay, Tashinori said with a small sigh, taking pity on Izuku who still felt overly flustered. I believe you. It took a bit of persuading to get Tashinori to pick out which of the movies to watch, as he wanted Izuku to choose. But in the end Izuku got his way and Tashinori chose. Then Izuku had to set up the DVD player because while Tashinori had one, he'd never actually taken it out of the box. He said it had been a gift, but that he didn't really have a use for it since he didn't watch many movies at home. Izuku supposed that made sense since Tashinori wasn't exactly home all the time anyway, and as a pro hero would have been very busy and too tired to do anything once he got home. But now that he was retired, surely he'd have some time to catch up on such things. Izuku decided he'd make it a goal to try to have a movie night with Tashinori at least once a month. Tashinori was kind of stiff sitting on the couch next to Izuku when the movie started playing. Izuku had sat directly next to him, and felt a little nervous himself. He wondered whether it would be okay to reach out and take Tashinori's hand, or maybe just lean against Tashinori. Izuku agonized so much he missed what was even happening in the movie. Toshinori didn't though. It didn't take long for Toshinori to start getting into the movie. His whole body relaxed as he watched, and a wistful expression came over his face. Izuku remembered why Toshinori had said he enjoyed romances. It was something lacking in his own life. The thought made Izuku's chest feel tight. Izuku's hand moved on its own. Reaching out, he set his hand on Toshinori's and gave his hand a light squeeze. Toshinori seemed to take comfort in it for a moment before seemingly shaking himself and pulling back. Izuku retracted his hand and looked away. He really wished Toshinori would stop overthinking things. When the movie finished, they got ready for bed. Izuku had brought pajamas in his bag so there would be no repeat of last time. He had mixed feelings about whether that was a good thing or not. Izuku left the bathroom and entered Toshinori's room to find that Toshinori was setting out the spare futon. He blinked. Toshinori blinked back, still crouched down and smoothing out the futon. "Why?" Izuku began, feeling a little nervous. He'd expected everything to be just like before. "What is it?" Toshinori asked. "I thought, maybe we could sleep together again." Izuku stammered before trailing off. His cheeks felt warm. Toshinori stilled and then frowned. "I don't know that that's a good idea," he said softly, carefully, as he stood up. He was withdrawing again, pulling back. And it was all Izuku's fault. "Why?" Izuku asked, trying to keep his emotions in check. Toshinori hadn't had a problem with it before. It was only now, after knowing Izuku's feelings, that he was refusing. It hurt, having Toshinori pull away like that. "Because I confessed?" Toshinori froze in place, his eyes widening. "That's—" Toshinori let out a long breath and gave Izuku a helpless look. "Nothing has to change," Izuku whispered softly, trying to keep his tears at bay. "I didn't mean for anything to." Izuku choked on the word, swallowed, cleared his throat. "Don't distance yourself from me. Please." He looked up at Toshinori, and his heart clenched at seeing that dismayed look on his thin face. Just pretend I never confessed." Izuku tried, but his voice broke. "But don't. I'm sorry." Toshinori reached out and gathered Izuku into his arms in a tight embrace. Izuku gasped, tried to keep the tears in, but they overflowed even as he clutched tightly to Toshinori. "I didn't mean to hurt you, I just—" Toshinori sighed heavily. "I'm just trying to do the right thing." Izuku hiccuped and pulled himself closer, burying his head in Toshinori's chest. "Wouldn't—" Toshinori trailed off, sighed. "Wouldn't it be harder for you to be close to me when you—" He couldn't seem to say the words. "But that was okay. I'll take whatever you'll give me," Izuku told him, voice small. "Even if it's just this," he sighed. It felt so right being like this, holding and being held by Toshinori. "But if why you're not, comfortable then?" "No." Toshinori shook his head and pulled Izuku closer. "It's fine, just stay with me for tonight." It was all the answer Izuku needed to know that the Jackal was right. Toshinori did have feelings for Izuku. How deep they were Izuku didn't know, but he planned on finding out. Toshi blinked his eyes open to find his room still very dark. It wasn't morning yet, so Toshi was confused as to why he had woken up. Then he felt it again. Izuku was pressing closer against him, his hands clenching and unclenching in the fabric of Toshi's shirt. Izuku was laying half on top of him, his face buried in the crook of Toshi's neck. "Izuku?" Toshi called his name softly, and the young man seemed to freeze. "Are you all right?" But Izuku didn't answer. Instead, he nuzzled the side of Toshi's face. Toshi's breath hitched. He hadn't meant to, it just sort of happened. Izuku stilled at the sound, and Toshi was about to apologize or say his name again when it happened. Izuku moved to find Toshi's lips, and then he kissed him. Toshi's mind blanked out. The kiss itself was a little awkward and unpracticed. It was painfully obvious either of them had ever kissed anyone before. But somehow, despite the lack of experience, the amount of emotion conveyed in that single hard press of Izuku's lips to Toshi's was enough to set Toshi's heart racing. Toshinori blamed it on just waking up that he didn't immediately push Izuku away, but that wasn't it. The truth was he didn't want to push Izuku away. Izuku kept kissing him, tilting his head so their noses wouldn't bump. Toshinori kissed back. Alarm bells rang in the back of his mind even as a small whine escaped his mouth. Izuku took it greedily, and the sound only served to spur Izuku on. His small hands framed Toshi's face, and his tongue darted out to lick at the seam of Toshi's lips. Wrong. This was wrong. They needed to stop. But he'd almost lost Izuku. Just that thought made his heart ache. The boy had been taken by villains, could have been killed. How could he push Izuku away when both of them had almost? No. It didn't matter. It wasn't right. He was just a boy. Izuku, stop, Toshi said, voice thick and his throat felt dry. He shoved lightly against his shoulders. Why? Izuku bit the word out, and it held so much more emotion than such a simple word should. His voice was a little off though, and now he was looking down at Toshi, eyes huge and pupils dilated. Toshi blinked. Izuku's eyes. His eyes, they were golden. Jackal? Toshi breathed the name, not fully believing at first because it was Izuku. His small frame and green hair and freckled face. Completely Izuku. But with golden eyes. The Jackal's eyes. Why should we stop? The Jackal demanded, sounding breathless. Toshi swallowed, still trying to comprehend what was happening. You want me? The Jackal purred, and its hand, Izuku's hand, snaked downward and palmed at the front of Toshi's pants. Toshi hissed. He was already hard. The Jackal was right. He did want Izuku. But this was wrong. Even more wrong now, knowing it wasn't Izuku who'd been kissing him. Toshinori. The Jackal breathed, a whine, a plea for something. No. Toshi bit the word out, and shoved on his shoulders again. The Jackal moved off of him looking displeased. But you want it. The Jackal repeated, reaching out again for Toshi's very obvious arousal. It's not right. Toshi ground out, pushing the Jackal's hand away and scrambling backward until his back hit the headboard of the bed. Why? The Jackal demanded. Because. Toshi stammered as his brain tried to remind the rest of his body why this was in fact a very bad idea. It's not right for Izuku to not know what you're doing with his body. I can wake him up. The Jackal offered immediately. No! Toshi stressed the word and felt his face burn. He couldn't face Izuku, not now, maybe not ever after that. There was an instant relief in knowing Izuku was asleep though, that he wouldn't remember any of this. Please, Jackal, you have to let this go. The Jackal stared at him, Izuku's expression changing from annoyed confusion to something far more sad and painful. You don't love me, the Jackal said slowly, like it was realizing it for the first time. That's. But you love Izuku. Toshinori's mouth snapped shut at the Jackal's words. No, it's accusation, Toshinori corrected. Except it hadn't sounded like an accusation so much as resignation. It's not that, Toshi said with a sigh and rested a hand on Izuku's, the Jackal's head. You are a part of Izuku. If. He let out a breath, not wanting to admit it, but knowing he needed to nonetheless. If I love Izuku, then I love you as well. The Jackal looked hopeful, a beautiful expression on Izuku's face. It couldn't stay. But only platonically. Toshi added quickly and coughed into his hand. Platonically? The Jackal repeated flatly. Toshi nodded, hoping that would be the end of it. But the Jackal gave a sly smile that looked wholly out of place on Izuku's face. The way you kissed back didn't feel very platonic, the way you're. Jackal! Toshi hissed its name sharply as his face flushed red. That's not, it isn't. Toshi sighed and ran a hand through his hair. Do I have to sleep on the futon now? The Jackal asked cautiously. That hurt of rejection was still so fresh on Izuku's face. Toshinori had never been good at denying Izuku anything. No, Toshi finally said, wondering if he'd regret the decision. Just go to sleep. The Jackal grinned widely before snuggling up close to Toshi and nuzzling against his arm. Toshi didn't go back to sleep after that, even after the jackal's breathing evened out, and it was clear it was asleep. His body still felt too hot. Platonic. That was what he'd told the jackal. But Toshi was pretty sure if his feelings were only platonic, his body wouldn't be reacting this way. He tried to tell himself it was a natural reaction since the jackal had kissed him and touched in somewhere he'd never been touched by anyone else. But he recognized it as a justification, as a lie. Toshi had been kissed by fans before. Fans who'd thrown themselves at him. Not consensual kisses or anything, but not something Toshi begrudged them. Either way, his body had never reacted that way to someone else's kiss, to a stranger's kiss. No, Toshi had to admit at that moment that his feelings were not platonic. He wasn't sure he could even continue lying to himself that his feelings were just mislabeled and misplaced. But venturing out of that denial meant facing a cold and bitter truth. Toshi was in love with a teenager. No, that wasn't something he wanted to admit, let alone think about. Only monsters, predators, had such thoughts. Toshi started tapping a beat lightly with his fingers against the bed. He mumbled lyrics to English songs he'd long since memorized along with Izuku all that time ago. It helped him avoid his thoughts. Kept him away from a path he was terrified of going down. He was still wide awake when the sun came up and Izuku began to stir alongside him. Izuku was still curled up next to him, Toshi still sitting up against the headboard. Yawning, Izuku sat up and rubbed at his eyes. He looked so young like that. Izuku noticed Toshi looking and the dark circles under his eyes. "Is something wrong?" Izuku asked, his brow creasing. When he spoke, Toshi's eyes were drawn to Izuku's lips. They were pink, and now Toshi knew just how soft they were too. Toshi felt his face coloring and averted his gaze, coughing into his hand. "Just, tired," he tried. "Did I keep you up?" Izuku sounded so worried, so concerned, so guilty. "No, no," Toshi assured him quickly. "It wasn't you. And it wasn't really. It was the jackal. Just part of getting old, I guess, trouble sleeping." He chuckled a little, but Izuku looked offended. "You're not old," Izuku told him. Toshi couldn't help smiling just a little at the young man's enthusiasm. He knew there was no arguing with the boy, and he didn't really want to tell Izuku just how old he was. Although Toshi had a feeling Izuku had a pretty good idea. "The provisional licensing exam is coming up," Toshi began, moving them to a safer topic. "Have you chosen your hero name yet?" Izuku hadn't interned at an agency like the rest of his classmates after the sports festival, so he hadn't needed to choose a hero name at that time and had elected not to. Toshi had his own theory as to why. It had been right after the USJ and Izuku had decided not to use his quirk again. Now that he was being provisionally licensed, though, he needed a hero name. "I have," Izuku said with a nod, though there was a little apprehension in his eyes. He hesitated. "Well?" Toshi prompted. Izuku met his gaze and one of his eyes turned golden. "Jackal."